My daughter abandoned her autistic son 9 years ago. I raised him alone. At 17, he built an application worth $7.5 million. Then she came back with a lawyer claiming his money. I panicked, thinking we might lose. But my grandson calmly whispered a single sentence that ruined her completely. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Wendell, 70 years old, a retired mechanic who spent his life fixing broken engines and picking up the pieces my family left behind. The harsh, rhythmic knock shattered the quiet morning routine I shared with my 17-year-old grandson, Jaden. I wiped the engine grease from my hands using an old shop rag and walked to the front door. I pulled the handle back. Kendra stood on my porch. My own flesh and blood had returned after 9 years of absolute, unforgivable silence. She did not look like the desperate girl who ran away. She wore a pristine designer coat and a cold, calculating expression. Beside her stood a slick white man in a tailored gray suit. He carried an air of unearned arrogance. I would soon learn his name was Colin. A third man flanked them, clutching a leather briefcase and wearing the unmistakable scowl of an aggressive attorney. They crossed my threshold without waiting for an invitation. The sanctuary I had built for Jaden was instantly violated by their presence. The scent of Kendra's expensive floral perfume mixed with the metallic smell of my workshop, creating a sickening contrast. I stared at my daughter, waiting for an apology or a tear. She offered neither. The attorney marched past me and slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto my oak dining table. The heavy thud echoed through the house. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was a custody petition. Kendra stepped forward, crossing her arms over her chest. She declared she was the biological mother and demanded immediate physical custody of Jaden. She spoke with a rehearsed, sterile tone, treating her own son like a piece of misplaced property she had finally decided to retrieve. To prove her supposed capability, she pulled a folded piece of paper from her designer handbag and tossed it next to the legal petition. It was a massive pay stub. The numbers printed on that paper were staggering, meant to intimidate a retired mechanic living on a fixed pension. She boasted about her expansive new house, her high-end lifestyle, and her undeniable financial superiority. Colin stood near the hallway, surveying my modest home with visible disdain. He adjusted his silk tie and smirked, acting as the silent enforcer of Kendra's demands. They painted a picture of absolute power and control. Kendra insisted my working-class environment was severely stunting Jaden's potential. She demanded I pack his bags immediately, threatening to call the authorities if I resisted her legal rights. The lawyer tapped his pen against the table, reminding me that courts heavily favor biological mothers with immense financial resources. They believed their display of wealth and legal force would crush my resolve. They expected a poor, tired old man to fold under the pressure of a sleek suit and a heavy paycheck. I looked at the paperwork, then at the woman who had abandoned her own flesh and blood. The audacity of her demands lit a fire in my chest. The anger rising in my throat was completely cold and razor-sharp. I pointed a calloused finger at the custody petition and delivered my response. I reminded Kendra of a freezing December night exactly 9 years ago. The wind chill had been far below zero. I woke up to a faint scratching sound at my front door. I opened it to find an 8-year-old Jaden shivering on the frozen concrete, clutching a worn blanket. He was entirely alone. Kendra had driven away into the dark, leaving behind a completely nonverbal child who could not even cry for help. She had pinned a single hastily scribbled note to his jacket collar. The words on that note were burned into my memory permanently. She had called her own child broken. She wrote that she could not fix a defective boy and needed to live her own life. I spent the next 9 years picking up the pieces she shattered. I paid for his specialized therapy using my retirement funds. I sat awake for countless nights calming his severe sensory overloads. I taught him how to communicate through computer code when the world demanded spoken words. I transformed a terrified, silent boy into a brilliant young man. Kendra did not send a single birthday card, make one phone call, or provide a dime of support during those 3,000 days. Now she stood in my kitchen demanding the finished product of my absolute sacrifice. I looked Colin dead in the eye and told him he was marrying a coward. Kendra flinched, but the greed in her eyes quickly overpowered her shame. She pointed at the legal documents, reminding me that past mistakes do not erase biological rights in the eyes of the family court system. Panic seized my chest with a brutal grip. Jaden requires strict routine. Any sudden change in his environment triggers intense, debilitating anxiety. The thought of handing him over to these ruthless strangers made my blood run cold. The lawyer reached into his briefcase to extract a pen, eager to force my signature. I braced myself for Jaden to panic, to cover his ears, to retreat into the safety of his room. Instead, my grandson walked calmly out of the hallway. He did not tremble. He did not hide. He moved with a quiet, calculated precision that caught everyone off guard. He stepped up to the dining table and leaned over the custody petition. His eyes scanned the dense legal jargon with the speed of a machine processing code. Kendra offered a fake, overly sweet smile, trying to act like a loving mother. Jaden completely ignored her existence. He turned to me, gently tugged the sleeve of my flannel shirt, and leaned in close. His voice was steady, lacking any trace of fear. He whispered a command that shifted the entire balance of power in the room. Grandpa let them sign for the assets. He turned around and walked back down the hallway, leaving the intruders utterly confused. My eyes fell from the custody petition to the kitchen counter. Resting beside the coffee pot was today's edition of the morning business paper. The front page headline screamed in bold, undeniable print. The revolutionary diagnostic application built by a local 17-year-old prodigy had just received a formal buyout offer of $7.5 million. Kendra had not returned for her son. She had returned for his fortune. She thought she was executing a brilliant robbery, but she was stepping into a trap. Kendra did not come to my house simply to argue. She came prepared for a physical extraction. She pulled a sleek smartphone from her coat pocket and tapped the screen twice. Within seconds, heavy footsteps pounded up my wooden porch stairs. 2 uniformed police officers stepped through my open front door. They stood tall, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts, scanning my living room as if I were holding hostages. Kendra immediately marched up to the lead officer. She reached into her designer handbag and aggressively shoved a crisp, sealed document directly into his face. It was an original birth certificate. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest and declared I was illegally detaining her minor child. She commanded the officers to remove Jaden from my custody right this second. The lead officer took the document, his eyes darting between the official state seal and Kendra's irate expression. He asked me to step away from the boy. I stood my ground, planting my feet firmly on the hardwood floor I had laid myself 30 years ago. I calmly informed the officers that I had raised this boy entirely alone for 3,000 days. I told them this woman had not seen her son since he was 8 years old. Kendra interrupted my defense with a loud theatrical sob. She played the role of a desperate mother separated from her beloved child by a tyrannical grandfather. The officers exchanged a heavy look. They were not judges or social workers. They were simply enforcers of immediate written law. The piece of paper in the officer's hand carried vastly more weight than my 9 years of sleepless nights, medical bills, and unwavering devotion. My sanctuary was fully breached. The officer stepped forward to execute her cruel demand. I stood absolutely still. The legal loophole tightened around my neck like a steel wire. The lead officer handed the document back to Kendra and let out a tired sigh. He explained that without a court order stripping Kendra of her parental rights, she remained the sole legal guardian. I felt the floor drop out from under me. 9 years ago, when I found Jaden shivering on my porch, I focused entirely on his immediate survival. I fed him, clothed him, and guided him through terrifying autistic meltdowns. I never hired a lawyer to formally terminate her parental rights because I foolishly believed her absence was permanent. That single oversight was now destroying everything I had built. Colin stepped forward, a smug grin plastered across his white face. He told the officers to hurry up and secure the boy so they could return to the city immediately. Kendra grabbed Jaden's arm, her grip harsh and completely lacking any maternal warmth. Jaden flinched violently. He detests physical contact from strangers. He began to rock back and forth, a clear warning sign of an impending sensory overload. I stepped between them and forcefully shoved Kendra's hand away. I warned her never to touch him like that again. The second officer placed his hand on his radio and ordered me to stand down. He stated clearly that they had no choice but to enforce the biological mother's claim today. According to state law, I was simply an extended family member withholding a minor from his rightful parent. The police warned me that if I continued to interfere, I would be arrested for kidnapping and obstruction of justice. My entire world was collapsing over a massive legal technicality. I needed a miracle, and I needed it within the next 60 seconds before they dragged my grandson away forever. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my lawyer, Nolan. I slammed the speakerphone button so his voice would echo through the tense living room. Nolan is a bulldog in the courtroom, a man who knows how to tear through legal red tape. I quickly explained the situation, detailing the police presence and Kendra's sudden ambush. Nolan did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He commanded the lead officer to identify himself and provide his badge number. The officer complied, clearly caught off guard by Nolan's aggressive, authoritative tone. Nolan instructed the police to halt all removal procedures immediately. He informed them that a transfer of custody involving a special needs child requires a mandatory psychological evaluation and a transitional period. While speaking, I heard the rapid clacking of Nolan's keyboard through the phone speaker. He was multitasking digitally, filing an emergency stay of execution directly with a friendly family court judge he knew well. Nolan confidently bluffed, telling the officers that a federal injunction was currently processing, and any forced removal would result in massive civil liability for the police department. The tactic worked perfectly. The officers stepped back, entirely unwilling to risk a complicated lawsuit over a domestic dispute. Within 3 minutes, Nolan secured the judge's electronic signature on the emergency stay. He proudly announced through the speaker that the court mandated a strict hold on the current living arrangement. We secured exactly 7 days before the preliminary hearing could take place. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the ultimate war had just begun. Nolan ordered Kendra and her slick husband to exit my property immediately or face severe charges for trespassing. I grabbed the front door handle and pulled it wide open, waiting for them to finally leave my house. They had to retreat. The lead officer pointed toward the exit, firmly instructing Kendra and Colin to take their dispute to the courtroom. Kendra glared at me with absolute venom. She adjusted her expensive coat, snatched the custody petition off the table, and marched out the door. Colin followed closely behind, glaring at my modest home with total disgust. The lawyer trailed them, muttering something about preparing for a vicious legal battle. I forcefully slammed the heavy door shut and locked the deadbolt tight. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to project absolute calm for Jaden's sake. I looked out the living room window. Kendra did not drive back to the city. Instead, she and Colin dragged their designer luggage into the luxury hotel located directly across the street from my house. They rented a corner suite on the top floor. I saw Colin standing on the balcony, staring down at my property like a vulture waiting for an animal to die. They were establishing a base of operations right on my doorstep. I knew they would not sit idle for 7 days waiting for a judge to decide their fate. They needed the application and the millions it promised immediately. The very next morning, the new conflict ignited with terrifying speed. I dropped Jaden off at his high school, ensuring he walked safely through the main double doors. I drove away to meet with Nolan to discuss our defense strategy. I had completely underestimated their sheer desperation and utter lack of morals. While I was sitting in my lawyer's office, Colin smoothly bypassed the school's front desk security protocol. He waited patiently in the dark shadows. He successfully intercepted Jaden right outside the school library, entirely ready to execute the very next phase of their ruthless scam. The predators were circling, and my vulnerable grandson was their primary target. The school librarian always let Jaden eat his lunch in the secluded back corner of the media center. It was his guaranteed safe zone, a heavily regimented environment completely free from the chaotic noise of the high school cafeteria. Colin violated that sanctuary without a second thought. The man slipped past the front desk security by flashing a counterfeit corporate badge and a charismatic smile. I learned the exact details later from the security footage. Colin marched straight to Jaden's table and dropped a heavy leather duffel bag onto the wooden surface. My grandson instantly recoiled, pressing his hands tightly over his ears to block out the sudden disruption. Colin did not apologize for the intrusion. He unzipped the bag and began pulling out devices that money could not legally buy on the open market. He lined up a prototype augmented reality headset, a next-generation quantum processing board, and a custom-built mechanical keyboard with specialized optical switches. Jaden dropped his hands. Technology is his native language. Colin knew precisely how to hack into a 17-year-old autistic boy's hyperfixation. He spread the gadgets out like bait in a steel trap. He spoke in a low, measured tone, invading Jaden's personal space while keeping his hands entirely visible. The school staff assumed Colin was a visiting college recruiter or a specialized guest speaker. No one intervened to protect my grandson. Jaden stared at the quantum processing board, his eyes tracking the intricate gold pathways etched into the silicon. Colin pushed the board closer deliberately, crossing the invisible boundary of Jaden's comfort zone. The man was a calculated predator disguised in a $1,000 suit, exploiting a teenager's pure love for computer engineering. He needed Jaden thoroughly distracted, and the shiny technological lures worked exactly as he intended. Colin sat across from my grandson and began painting a masterpiece of a lie. He introduced himself as a premier angel investor representing the most elite venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. He spun a glorious tale of limitless resources and global domination. Colin promised to scale Jaden's diagnostic application to every major hospital network on the planet. He painted a vivid picture of private jets, limitless server space, and a dedicated team of junior developers working directly under Jaden's command. He handed Jaden the prototype augmented reality headset, encouraging him to feel the weight of the hardware. As Jaden inspected the device, Colin delivered the poisoned hook. He leaned across the table and stated that all of this unparalleled success required a proper legal foundation. Colin claimed that a retired mechanic living in a modest house could never facilitate a multi-million-dollar technology launch. He insisted that Jaden needed to relocate to the luxury hotel with him and Kendra. Colin promised that Kendra had completely changed and was ready to act as his official corporate manager. He framed the abandonment as a simple misunderstanding, a minor hurdle on the path to generational wealth. He told Jaden that signing the custody transfer was the only way to unlock the true potential of the application. Colin used big corporate buzzwords to mask the sinister reality of his demands. He promised absolute freedom, disguising a total hostile takeover as a lucrative partnership. Jaden remained silent, processing the flood of auditory information while his fingers traced the edges of the quantum board. Colin mistook that silence for compliance. He thought his manipulative sales pitch was securing the billion-dollar code. He believed he was outsmarting a vulnerable teenager, entirely unaware of the intricate mental calculations happening behind Jaden's quiet eyes. I received an automated text message from the school attendance system notifying me of an unexcused absence for Jaden's afternoon period. I drove my truck straight to the campus, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I bypassed the front office, relying on 30 years of attending parent-teacher conferences to navigate the halls unseen. I found them in the back of the media center. I did not shout. I did not create a public spectacle that would trigger Jaden's anxiety. I simply walked up behind Colin with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who spent decades hauling engine blocks. Colin reached his hand out to pat Jaden on the shoulder, attempting to seal his fraudulent deal with physical contact. I intercepted the movement mid-air. I clamped my calloused hand around Colin's manicured wrist, squeezing with enough mechanical force to grind his bones together. Colin gasped, his smug expression instantly dissolving into genuine pain. I leaned down until my face was inches from his ear. I quietly informed him that if he ever approached my grandson again, he would leave the premises in an ambulance. I released his wrist, shoving his arm back toward his chest. I did not wait for his response. I placed my hand gently on the back of Jaden's chair, giving him our designated physical cue to depart. Jaden stood up immediately, leaving the expensive gadgets untouched on the table. I positioned myself squarely between my grandson and the predator, shielding the boy with my body. We walked out of the library in absolute silence. Colin rubbed his bruised wrist, staring daggers into my back. We marched straight to my truck, leaving the school grounds before the administration even realized a confrontation had occurred. The true magnitude of Colin's library ambush revealed itself late that night. The house was dead quiet. I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing legal documents when a piercing digital alarm erupted from Jaden's bedroom. It was not a standard notification sound. It was the high-pitched siren Jaden programmed specifically for severe security breaches. I rushed down the hallway and pushed his door open. Jaden was typing furiously, his fingers flying across the glowing keyboard. Lines of red code cascaded down his primary monitor. He did not look away from the screen as he delivered the grim damage report. His custom firewall had detected an aggressive, unauthorized data extraction protocol. Colin had not visited the school just to manipulate a teenager with hollow promises of wealth. The entire conversation was a calculated diversion. While Jaden was examining the prototype augmented reality headset, Colin had stealthily plugged a microscopic, wireless flash drive into the back of Jaden's laptop. The device was a military-grade spyware tool designed to silently clone the hard drive and transmit the contents to an external server. The antagonists were not waiting for the judge to rule on the custody petition. They were actively attempting to steal the raw source code of the diagnostic application right out from under us. They wanted to bypass the family court system entirely and secure the $7.5 million asset before dawn. Jaden executed a hard kill switch, manually severing his computer's connection to the internet router. The scrolling red text abruptly stopped, freezing the data transfer at 42%. Colin had managed to siphon a significant chunk of the encrypted files. The battle had officially escalated from a bitter family dispute over custody into a high-stakes corporate espionage heist. We were under direct digital attack. I wiped the remaining engine grease from my hands, refusing to waste a single second staring at the frozen progress bar. I disconnected the laptop from its power source, grabbed my truck keys, and hurried Jaden out the door. We drove straight to Nolan's downtown office. I pounded on his heavy glass door until he appeared, nodding his tie with a groggy expression. His annoyance vanished the moment Jaden booted up the disconnected machine and displayed the malicious code. Nolan immediately called in an independent cybersecurity forensic expert he kept on retainer. The expert arrived within 20 minutes. He bypassed Colin's amateur encryption in seconds. The drive contained a highly aggressive worm programmed to siphon every line of the application's source code straight to an untraceable offshore server. Colin was attempting to execute a multi-million-dollar digital heist while pretending to be a concerned stepfather. The expert successfully quarantined the spyware within a virtual sandbox, preventing any further data loss while preserving the digital fingerprints Colin carelessly left behind. I wanted to march straight to the local police precinct and have Colin arrested for cybercrimes immediately. Nolan stopped me with a firm hand on my shoulder. He explained that involving the police right now would only trigger a lengthy jurisdictional nightmare and delay the custody battle. Nolan advised absolute disciplined silence. We needed to let Colin and Kendra believe their extraction protocol was still running smoothly in the background. Giving them a false sense of security would force them to make a far more arrogant and legally fatal mistake. I hated playing defense, but I understood the tactical necessity. I drove Jaden back home as the sun began to rise. The digital attack was neutralized, but the psychological warfare was just beginning. My phone buzzed in my pocket before I even parked the truck. The text message glowing on my screen contained a simple address and a time. Kendra demanded a meeting at a desolate diner positioned off the interstate, far away from the prying eyes of our local neighborhood. The neon sign outside flickered erratically, casting harsh red shadows across the parking lot. I left Jaden safely secured at home, with my trusted neighbor issuing strict instructions to call the authorities if anyone approached the porch. I arrived at the diner precisely at noon. The air smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee. Kendra sat alone in a back corner booth. She wore oversized dark sunglasses and a sleek trench coat that looked completely out of place against the peeling vinyl seats. She did not bother to greet me. She did not ask how her son was handling the sudden disruption to his heavily structured life. She simply reached down to the floor and hoisted a heavy silver aluminum briefcase onto the sticky table. She unlatched the dual locks with a sharp metallic snap and spun the case around to face me. Inside sat neatly stacked bundles of crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. She informed me the case contained exactly $100,000 in untraceable cash. She presented it not as a gift, but as a severe calculated transaction. She leaned across the table, her voice dripping with venomous confidence. She told me this was my official severance package. Kendra demanded I take the cash walk away from the custody battle and legally surrender Jaden to her and Colin before the court date. She framed the bribe as a generous retirement bonus for an old man who had outlived his usefulness. She actually believed my loyalty to the boy I raised had a specific market value. I stared at the money, absolutely disgusted by her moral bankruptcy. I flatly rejected her dirty money. I pushed the briefcase back across the table, demanding she leave town and never contact us again. Kendra's arrogant smile morphed into a vicious sneer. She pulled a glossy manila folder from her coat pocket and tossed it directly onto the bundles of cash. She commanded me to look inside. I flipped the cover open and felt my stomach drop to the floor. The folder contained dozens of highly realistic, artificially generated photographs. The artificial shadows and lighting in the pictures were flawlessly rendered to deceive the naked eye. The images depicted me screaming at Jaden, physically striking him and forcing him to code in a dark, filthy basement. Colin had clearly utilized advanced deep-fake technology to meticulously manufacture a horrifying narrative of severe child abuse. Kendra delivered her ultimate blood-chilling threat. If I refused the buyout and fought her in family court, she would submit every single fabricated image to the judge as irrefutable evidence of my brutality. She would simultaneously leak the photos to every major news network in the country. She planned to publicly brand me as a monster exploiting an autistic savant in a modern-day digital sweatshop. She promised the resulting media frenzy would guarantee I died in a federal prison cell while she walked away with her son and his fortune. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest, explaining that the truth simply did not matter anymore. The court of public opinion would entirely destroy my reputation the second those images hit the internet. She was prepared to utterly ruin my life and deeply traumatize her own child just to secure her massive payday. She snapped the briefcase shut, leaving the toxic folder on the table. She gave me exactly 24 hours to sign the custody surrender forms or face total annihilation. I drove back home with my jaw clenched tight enough to crack my teeth. Kendra had backed me into a terrifying, inescapable corner. I called Nolan immediately from my truck and described the deep-faked photographs. My lawyer cursed loudly into the receiver. He explained the brutal reality of our justice system. Proving the images were artificially generated required hiring elite digital forensic analysts. That highly specialized verification process would take several months to complete. We did not have several months. The major tech corporation aiming to purchase Jaden's diagnostic application had established a strict 14-day deadline to finalize the $7.5 million acquisition. If Kendra released those vile photos to the press tomorrow, the corporate executives would instantly terminate the buyout to protect their brand from the explosive public relations disaster. The scandal would kill the deal, traumatize Jaden, and likely land me in a holding cell pending an official child welfare investigation. Kendra and Colin had engineered a seemingly perfect checkmate. They weaponized my love for my grandson against me. I parked in my driveway, gripping the steering wheel as a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I refused to let two greedy predators steal my grandson's future. I could not fight fabricated digital evidence with simple truth in a matter of hours. I realized that defending my character was a losing battle. I needed to shift the dynamic entirely. If I could not prove my own innocence in time, I had to completely expose their guilt. I needed immediate devastating leverage to destroy Colin and Kendra before they could execute their media strike. I needed to know exactly why a slick tech investor and a runaway mother were acting with such reckless criminal desperation. I locked the truck, fully resolved to dig up their darkest secrets. I did not utter a single word of negotiation. I placed my calloused hands flat against the edge of the aluminum briefcase and shoved it violently forward. The metal container flipped over the edge of the table. The dual locks burst open upon impact with the linoleum floor. $100,000 in crisp bills spilled across the sticky diner tiles, scattering like worthless trash. Kendra gasped, lunging out of the vinyl booth to desperately gather her dirty money. I turned my back on her and walked straight out the front door. The cold night air hit my face, but the fire burning in my chest kept me warm. I climbed into my truck and jammed the key into the ignition. The heavy engine roared to life. I did not go home. I drove directly to the main branch of my bank, arriving precisely as the heavy glass doors unlocked for the morning shift. I marched to the front desk and demanded a meeting with the branch manager. I sat in his plush office and instructed him to liquidate my entire retirement savings account immediately. He tried to warn me about the massive tax penalties and the severe risks of emptying a pension I had built over 40 years of grueling mechanical labor. I silenced him with a sharp glare. I told him my grandson was the only investment that mattered. I watched the manager type the final authorization codes. The printer hummed loudly, producing the certified cashier check representing my entire life work. I folded the heavy paper and placed it securely in my breast pocket. I walked out of the bank with absolutely zero financial safety net, but I possessed the exact amount of liquid capital required to wage a ruthless war against these truly dangerous corporate predators. I drove across the city to an unassuming industrial park. I bypassed the sleek downtown law firms and parked outside a heavily fortified concrete building. This was the headquarters of the most ruthless private investigative firm in the state. The men inside did not handle simple cheating spouse cases. They dismantled corporate espionage networks and tracked hidden offshore assets. I walked into the sterile reception area and demanded an immediate audience with the lead investigator. A massive man with cold, calculating eyes emerged from a back room. He motioned me into a soundproof office constructed entirely of reinforced steel and glass. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my breast pocket, retrieved the certified cashier check representing my entire liquidated retirement, and slapped it onto his metal desk. I told him the money was his retainer. I demanded a complete, exhaustive dissection of Colin and his entire existence. I needed his bank records, his encrypted communications, his deleted internet history, and his hidden digital footprints. I wanted to know every single dirty secret the man had ever tried to bury. The investigator stared at the massive sum printed on the check, then looked up at my hardened face. I explicitly stated that I did not care about legal boundaries or conventional operating hours. I needed actionable, devastating intelligence, and I needed it delivered to me within 24 hours. I refused to let my grandson become collateral damage in a scheme I did not fully understand. The investigator nodded slowly, pocketing the check without a single flinch. He promised to rip Colin and his life apart at the seams. I left the facility knowing I had just unleashed a highly trained digital bloodhound upon a completely unsuspecting target. They had started a ruthless war. I ended it. Exactly 22 hours later, my phone vibrated with a secure encrypted message. The private investigator summoned me back to his heavily fortified industrial office. I arrived and sat across from his metal desk. He handed me a thick black folder overflowing with printed financial documents and intercepted emails. The investigator did not smile as he delivered the devastating facts. Colin was an absolute fraud. He was not an angel investor, and he held absolutely zero connections to any elite venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. The man was a completely failed cryptocurrency scammer. 2 years ago, Colin had launched a fraudulent digital token scheme designed to steal millions from amateur investors. The criminal operation had collapsed spectacularly. Colin had successfully defrauded the wrong people. He had stolen money directly from a highly violent organized crime syndicate operating out of Chicago. The detailed financial ledgers inside the black folder proved Colin currently carried an illicit unpayable debt of exactly $3 million. The syndicate had already frozen his bank accounts and liquidated his remaining personal assets. Colin was completely bankrupt and terrified for his life. The investigator pulled a series of intercepted text messages from the folder. The messages contained explicit graphic threats sent directly from the Chicago mob bosses to Colin and his personal phone. The syndicate was tracking his every movement. They knew he was staying at the hotel across the street from my house. The illusion of a wealthy, successful tech executive evaporated instantly. Colin was merely a highly desperate rat trapped in a lethal corner, desperately searching for a massive financial payload to instantly buy his continued survival. Jaden and his revolutionary diagnostic application was not a business venture to him. The massive software buyout was the single thing standing between Colin and a cold grave. The revelations contained within the folder completely destroyed Kendra and her false maternal narrative. The investigator slid a copy of a signed illegal promissory note across the steel desk. Kendra was not just an innocent bystander or a clueless wife caught in the crossfire. She was an official co-signer on the massive $3 million syndicate debt. Her signature bound her fate directly to Colin and his criminal failures. The intercepted communications clearly outlined the horrific ultimatum handed down by the mob bosses. The violent Chicago syndicate had given Colin and Kendra exactly 30 days to produce the $3 million in untraceable cash. If they failed to deliver the funds, they would forfeit their lives. Their sudden reappearance after 9 years of total absence had absolutely nothing to do with maternal regret or a newfound desire for a loving family reunion. Their desperation was purely unapologetically lethal. They were two terrified criminals fleeing from an execution squad. They did not care about Jaden. They did not want the boy. They only wanted his valuable software code. The ruthless custody petition, the fake abuse photos, and the highly aggressive lawyer were all carefully calculated mechanics of a massive heist designed to save their own skin. If they won full custody, they could legally sell the entire application, pay off the brutal mafia debt, and likely abandon Jaden again without a single second thought. I grabbed the folder and thanked the private investigator for his ruthless efficiency. The dynamic of the entire war had shifted instantly. I was no longer a frightened grandfather fighting a wealthy mother for custody of a special needs child. I was the sole guardian standing firmly between my innocent grandson and two completely desperate criminals. I possessed the absolute truth, and I was ready now. The retaliation for rejecting her bribe came faster than I anticipated. The very next morning, the local television stations broadcasted Kendra's ruthless counterattack across the entire city. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and watched my daughter execute a flawless performance on the most popular morning talk show in the state. She sat on a plush studio sofa dressed in modest, unassuming clothing, specifically chosen to project maternal warmth and vulnerability. She did not look like the woman who had demanded a ransom for my grandson in a greasy diner just hours prior. She looked directly into the camera and wept. Real physical tears rolled down her cheeks as she detailed a fabricated story of agonizing separation. She claimed she had spent the last 9 years desperately fighting to reunite with her autistic son. She painted herself as the tragic victim of a tyrannical, deeply controlling father. She explicitly told the sympathetic anchor that I had legally bullied her hidden Jaden away and systematically alienated her from her own flesh and blood. She described my modest home as an isolated prison where Jaden was completely cut off from the outside world and basic maternal affection. Kendra sobbed as she begged the public for help manipulating the emotions of thousands of viewers who had no idea they were watching a desperate criminal facing a massive syndicate debt. Her acting was terrifyingly good. She perfectly weaponized her tears to destroy my character on live television. I watched my reputation shatter in real time. The anchor offered her a box of tissues, completely buying into the narrative of a loving mother wrongfully denied access to her child. The media strike had landed with devastating precision, setting the stage for her next lethal move. The performance escalated from emotional manipulation to deliberate, calculated defamation within seconds. Kendra reached into a neat leather portfolio resting on her lap and pulled out a stack of crisp, official-looking papers. She handed the documents directly to the television anchor on live broadcast. She solemnly declared that these were my highly confidential, recently obtained psychiatric and medical records. My blood turned to absolute ice. The anchor adjusted his glasses and read the highlighted sections aloud for the entire city to hear. The forged papers claimed I suffered from rapidly advancing dementia, severe paranoia, and dangerous delusions. The fabricated psychiatric evaluation explicitly stated that I was entirely unfit to provide adequate care for a vulnerable special needs minor. Colin had clearly utilized the criminal document forger paid for by the Chicago syndicate to manufacture an airtight, medically terrifying profile of a collapsing old man. Kendra stared into the camera and told the viewers she feared for her son's immediate physical safety. She claimed my supposed paranoia was the only reason I was viciously blocking her maternal custody rights. The anchor held the papers up to the studio lights, treating the criminal forgeries as absolute, irrefutable truth. They broadcasted the fake physician signatures and the counterfeit hospital letterheads to millions of homes. The public narrative solidified instantly. I was no longer viewed as a dedicated grandfather protecting a brilliant autistic teenager. I was instantly rebranded as a sick, delusional, and highly dangerous elderly man holding a child hostage. Kendra had successfully planted a massive seed of doubt in the minds of the public, the courts, and anyone else watching. She knew the legal system would err on the side of caution when presented with such alarming medical claims. The damage was immediate, catastrophic, and completely irreversible without an extended legal battle. The fallout from the morning broadcast struck before the television program even concluded. My cell phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter. It was Nolan. His usual calm, professional demeanor was entirely gone. He spoke with a rapid, clipped urgency that signaled an absolute disaster. Nolan informed me that the lead legal counsel for the Silicon Valley Tech Corporation had been watching the morning news segment. The corporate executives were utterly terrified by the sudden public spectacle surrounding their highly anticipated acquisition. Corporate entities absolutely despise unpredictable public relations nightmares and volatile family custody disputes. Nolan delivered the crushing verdict without any sugarcoating. The tech corporation was officially freezing the $7.5 million buyout of Jaden's diagnostic application. They cited extreme liability risks and a massive breach of confidence. They categorically refused to transfer millions of dollars to a family currently embroiled in a highly publicized, deeply messy custody war involving allegations of severe elder dementia and child endangerment. The legal team enacted a strict halt on all negotiations until the state courts completely resolved the guardianship and intellectual property ownership disputes. Kendra's calculated media strike had successfully frozen our only leverage. The massive financial asset was now locked behind an impenetrable wall of corporate liability tape. Colin and Kendra had intentionally sabotaged the sale to corner me. They knew that by freezing the funds, they were stripping away my ability to fight them in a prolonged legal war. They wanted to starve me of resources and force a rapid, unconditional surrender. Nolan promised to fight the corporate freeze, but he warned me that the legal reality was incredibly bleak. The corporation would never risk their pristine public image by stepping into our domestic battlefield. The massive fortune Jaden had built was suddenly entirely out of our reach. The final blow of the morning arrived precisely 10 minutes after I disconnected the call with Nolan. A plain white sedan pulled into my driveway, parking directly behind my truck. Two stern-faced individuals stepped out of the vehicle carrying thick clipboards and identification badges. They walked up my porch steps and knocked firmly on my front door. I opened it to find two state agents from Child Protective Services standing on my welcome mat. They did not smile. They informed me that they had received multiple anonymous emergency reports regarding the immediate safety of a minor residing in my home. The forged medical documents broadcasted on live television had triggered an automatic mandatory state welfare investigation. The agents demanded entry to inspect the premises and interview Jaden without my presence. My reputation in the community was completely in ruins. Neighbors who had known me for 30 years were now peering through their curtains, watching state agents investigate my home for child endangerment. I stepped aside and allowed the agents to enter, knowing that any resistance would be legally weaponized against me as proof of my supposed paranoia. The agents scrutinized every corner of my living room, searching for signs of the squalor Kendra had described on television. They were actively looking for reasons to remove my grandson from my care today. I faced the genuine terrifying risk of losing Jaden to the state foster system before we even had a chance to step into the courtroom for the preliminary hearing. The trap had closed tightly around us. Kendra and Colin had successfully used the media to transform me into a legal liability. I stood in my kitchen, entirely stripped of my resources, my reputation, and my security, watching the state evaluate my fitness to protect my own grandson. The state child welfare agents finish their exhaustive inspection and leave my house with non-committal expressions. They find no squalor, but they meticulously document my elevated blood pressure and obvious distress as potential signs of instability. Nolan arrives at my house 30 minutes after their white sedan pulls out of my driveway. He drops his heavy leather briefcase onto the dining room table with a loud, defeated thud. The seasoned attorney sits across from me and delivers a brutally bleak reality check. He states clearly that the preliminary custody hearing is officially scheduled for tomorrow morning. He warns me that family court judges are extremely risk-averse when presented with highly publicized medical allegations. The deep-faked psychiatric records Kendra leaked to the local media have entirely poisoned the well. Nolan explains that proving those complex documents are sophisticated forgeries requires formal subpoenas, expert testimonies, and months of forensic digital analysis. We do not have months. We have exactly 24 hours remaining today. Nolan crosses his arms and delivers the hardest truth I have ever heard. He guarantees we will absolutely lose the preliminary custody hearing. The judge will grant Kendra temporary emergency physical custody simply to shield the state from any public liability. The news broadcast successfully transformed me from a dedicated grandfather into an unstable, dangerous threat. Nolan advises me to prepare for the inevitable separation. He promises we will win the permanent custody trial 6 months down the road after the experts completely dismantle Colin's deep fakes. But 6 months is an absolute eternity. Colin and Kendra only need 30 days to secure the buyout and pay off their massive Chicago syndicate debt. Handing Jaden over to them right now means delivering him straight into the hands of desperate, cornered criminals. I feel the air leave my burning lungs entirely. Absolute panic consumes my entire body. I stand up from the dining table and begin pacing the hardwood floor. My heavy boots strike the wooden planks in a frantic, uneven rhythm. I cannot seem to breathe properly. The mechanical precision I have relied on my entire life completely shatters under the weight of this impending catastrophe. I look down the hallway toward Jaden's bedroom door. The thought of my grandson sleeping under the same roof as a ruthless mob debtor makes my chest ache with genuine physical pain. Colin and Kendra are running out of time to pay $3 million to a lethal Chicago crime syndicate. They are trapped animals fighting for basic survival. They will use any aggressive tactic necessary to force Jaden into unlocking the frozen application buyout. They will undoubtedly scream at him, manipulate his strict routines, and subject him to unimaginable psychological torture to get the administrative passwords. I visualize Colin putting his manicured hands on my grandson in anger. My fists clench so tightly my fingernails dig into my calloused palms. I stop my frantic pacing and grip the cold edge of the kitchen counter. I stare across the street. The luxury hotel stands like a dark fortress. My daughter is sitting in a penthouse suite over there actively planning the destruction of the boy she threw away 9 years ago. Nolan tries to offer comforting legal platitudes, but his words bounce off my completely deaf ears. Legal strategies mean absolutely nothing if Jaden is subjected to weeks of trauma inside the tiger's den. I refuse to let the state forcibly drag an autistic minor into a hostile, highly volatile environment. I desperately search my exhausted mind for a single violent physical solution to permanently stop them today. While I spiral into a suffocating rage, Jaden completely ignores the suffocating chaos filling my house. He sits perfectly still at his custom computer workstation in the dark living room alcove. The loud, rhythmic clicking of his mechanical keyboard cuts through the heavy silence following Nolan's grim legal diagnosis. Jaden's eyes remain locked on his dual monitors. He is not panicking. He is operating with the cold, absolute clarity of a master architect protecting his flawless creation. He understands exactly what Colin and Kendra are trying to illegally steal. Jaden types a rapid sequence of complex commands into his command terminal. He actively isolates the authentic artificial intelligence algorithm powering his revolutionary diagnostic application. He severs the core data completely from the main user interface. Within seconds, he locks the true functioning algorithm behind multiple layers of military-grade encryption. He strips the complex application down to its bare, aesthetic bones. He then spins up a completely separate, functional but heavily hollow dummy server. He skillfully reroutes the public-facing application to this new, empty shell. The interface still looks absolutely perfect. It displays the same sleek loading screens, the same complex login portals, and the same vibrant data charts. However, the revolutionary engine driving the software is entirely gone. The application is now nothing more than a beautiful, useless digital ghost. Colin and Kendra want to sell a $7.5 million masterpiece, but Jaden has secretly swapped the original painting with a worthless photocopy. Jaden executes the final firewall protocol. The screen flashes green, confirming the total isolation of his intellectual property. The real algorithm now exists only on a single, heavily encrypted offline drive hidden deep within his secure hardware architecture. He turns his chair around, leaving the fake application running brightly on the main screen for absolutely anyone to clearly see. Jaden looks up from his workstation with absolute clarity radiating from his calm brown eyes. He does not exhibit a single trace of fear regarding the impending custody transfer. He looks at me and then shifts his gaze directly to my stunned attorney. The teenager speaks with an unwavering, definitive tone that commands total respect. He repeats the exact same instruction he whispered to me on the day his mother first breached our front porch. "Let them win the preliminary hearing," Jaden states firmly. "They want the app. I will give them the app." I stare at my grandson, rapidly processing the sheer brilliance of his digital trap. He has purposefully created a magnificent Trojan horse. If we fight them viciously in court tomorrow, Colin and Kendra will maintain their victim narrative and continue their destructive media strike. But if we simply surrender, they will eagerly walk away with the hollow server, firmly believing they have successfully stolen the $1 million prize. They will lower their defenses entirely to finalize the massive corporate transaction. I look at Nolan. The lawyer slowly closes his briefcase, a sharp predatory smile spreading across his face as he finally grasps the magnitude of Jaden's brilliant backward gambit. I cross the room and place both of my heavy hands squarely on Jaden's shoulders. I look into the eyes of the brilliant boy I raised. I ask him if he is absolutely certain he can survive inside their hostile penthouse for the duration of the corporate audit. Jaden nods once, displaying zero hesitation. The plan is officially locked into place. I turn back to Nolan and deliver my final definitive order. I agree to orchestrate our own devastating courtroom defeat. Tomorrow morning, we will simply let the greedy traitors walk away with a completely worthless digital illusion. The morning of the preliminary custody hearing arrives with a suffocating chill. I drive Jaden to the downtown courthouse, navigating through a chaotic sea of local news vans and aggressive reporters. Kendra's media strike was ruthlessly effective. Cameras flash in our faces the second my boots hit the pavement. Reporters shout questions about my mental state and accusations of child exploitation. I ignore them completely, keeping a firm grip on Jaden's shoulder to ground him against the overwhelming sensory assault. We push through the heavy wooden doors and enter the courtroom. The gallery is packed with journalists eager to cover the downfall of a supposedly abusive grandfather. Kendra and Colin sit at the plaintiff's table. Kendra wears a simple conservative dress specifically chosen to project fragile innocence. When the judge calls the session to order, Kendra takes the stand and delivers a flawless, Oscar-worthy performance. She weaponizes her tears perfectly. She weaves a devastating narrative of a young, overwhelmed mother who made a terrible mistake 9 years ago, only to be systematically blocked from making amends by a tyrannical father. She portrays my protection as imprisonment. She points at me with trembling fingers, claiming my declining mental health has turned my house into a dangerous sweatshop. The deep-faked abuse photos sit prominently on the judge's desk, serving as the silent, damning core of her entire argument. She sobs uncontrollably, begging the court to rescue her son from a miserable existence. The entire courtroom watches her with absolute sympathy. The judge nods slowly, clearly captivated by the tragic fiction she is spinning under oath. The trap is working exactly as she planned, but she has no idea she is walking directly into ours. Nolan shifts uncomfortably in his leather chair beside me. He is a fighter by nature, a man conditioned to rip apart false testimonies with aggressive cross-examinations. He opens his briefcase and places his hand on the thick black folder provided by our private investigator. That folder contains the absolute truth. It holds the undeniable proof of Colin's $3 million debt to the violent Chicago syndicate. It holds the intercepted text messages detailing the mafia death threats. It holds the absolute destruction of Kendra's fragile mother routine. Nolan leans toward me and whispers that we can end this charade right now by submitting the syndicate evidence to the judge. I look at my attorney and shake my head. I place my heavy, calloused hand firmly over his and command him to sit down. I instruct him to offer zero defense. Nolan stares at me in utter disbelief, reminding me that remaining silent guarantees a brutal legal defeat. I tell him our silence is the entire point of the strategy. We must let them believe their fraudulent narrative has completely succeeded. If we expose the mafia debt now, the judge will intervene, the police will investigate, and the corporate buyout will remain frozen indefinitely under a cloud of federal scrutiny. Jaden needs Colin to finalize the acquisition using the dummy server to trigger the corporate audit. To catch a predator, you must let them think they have successfully cornered their prey. Nolan swallows hard, closes the black folder, and shoves it back into the depths of his briefcase. The judge asks our defense table if we have any witnesses to call or evidence to present to counter the plaintiff's severe allegations. I look directly into Kendra's triumphant eyes and state clearly that we have absolutely nothing to say. A heavy, uncomfortable silence blankets the packed courtroom following my complete surrender. The journalists in the gallery furiously type on their phones, rapidly broadcasting my lack of defense to the entire city. The family court judge narrows his eyes, staring down at me with profound disgust. He views my silence as an absolute admission of guilt. He looks at the deep-faked photographs and the forged psychiatric evaluations, then turns his sympathetic gaze back toward Kendra. He adjusts his microphone and begins to deliver his ruling with a stern, authoritative voice. He states that the court's primary obligation is to ensure the immediate physical and emotional safety of the minor child. He declares that the unrefuted medical evidence regarding my mental instability leaves the court with no other viable option. He praises Kendra for her supposed bravery in coming forward to rescue her son from an exploitative environment. He speaks about the importance of maternal bonds and second chances, entirely validating the massive lie Colin and Kendra spent weeks constructing. The judge raises his wooden gavel high in the air. He brings it down with a sharp, definitive crack that echoes off the marble walls. He officially awards Kendra immediate temporary physical custody of Jaden for a mandatory period of 60 days. He labels it a reunification placement, ordering me to surrender all of Jaden's belongings and strictly forbidding me from initiating any unapproved contact. Kendra bursts into fresh tears, burying her face in Colin's shoulder to hide her victorious smirk. They have legally stolen my grandson in broad daylight. The media narrative is cemented. The corporate executives watching from afar will now feel comfortable moving forward with the mother as the rightful legal guardian. The legal battle is lost precisely as planned. We walk out of the courthouse under the oppressive glare of the afternoon sun. The media swarm surrounds us instantly, shouting aggressive questions about my profound legal defeat. I ignore the noise, keeping my focus entirely on the boy walking quietly beside me. We reach the designated loading zone where Colin has parked his rented luxury SUV. The black vehicle idles loudly, waiting to transport my grandson away from the only stable home he has ever known. Kendra stands by the open rear door, gesturing impatiently for Jaden to hurry up. Colin leans against the passenger side, wearing a look of absolute, arrogant victory. He believes he has just secured the key to his $3 million survival. I stop at the curb. My chest tightens with an agonizing, genuine physical pain. Every instinct forged over 9 years of raising this boy screams at me to physically tear Colin apart and drag Jaden back to my truck. Watching my grandson step toward individuals who view him solely as a financial asset requires a level of restraint I did not know I possessed. Jaden does not look back. He does not show a single ounce of fear or hesitation. He adjusts the strap of his backpack, climbs into the back seat of the SUV, and stares straight ahead. Kendra slams the heavy door shut, severing my physical connection to my grandson. The tinted windows hide him from view. Colin slides into the driver's seat and aggressively accelerates away from the curb, leaving me standing alone in a cloud of exhaust. The pain in my heart is immense, but the tactical reality remains absolute. The digital Trojan horse is securely inside their walls. The trap is officially set. Jaden has entered the tiger's den. The heavy doors of the luxury SUV locked with a sharp electronic click. I sat perfectly still in the pristine leather back seat, keeping my eyes fixed on the precise stitching of the headrest in front of me. The engine hummed with a low frequency that vibrated through my boots. Kendra sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. She did not attempt to hold my hand or ask how I felt. The tearful, desperate mother from the courtroom vanished the exact second the cameras were no longer watching. Colin drove with aggressive, jerky movements, navigating the downtown traffic with angry impatience. The silence inside the vehicle was absolute. I ran my thumb over the rough nylon strap of my backpack, grounding my sensory inputs. We pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Colin parked the vehicle in a private gated VIP section. They escorted me into a private elevator. Colin swiped a key card, and we ascended 30 floors without stopping. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse suite. The walls were constructed of cold, floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the city. Kendra kicked off her modest courtroom shoes and immediately poured herself a large glass of vodka from a crystal decanter on the kitchen island. She did not offer me a drink. She did not welcome me home. The calculated performance was officially over. I stood in the center of their massive living room, calculating my exact position within the hostile environment. I was inside the tiger's den. I needed to execute the next phase of the sequence precisely as I had engineered it in my basement workstation. Colin marched across the sleek hardwood floor and stood directly in front of me. He held out his hand, palm up, his jaw clenched tight. He demanded my cell phone. He stated I would not be making any outside contact while residing under his roof. I reached into my pocket and handed over the device without a single word of protest. Colin powered the phone down and shoved it into his suit pocket. He grabbed my upper arm, his grip unnecessarily tight, and steered me down a long, stark white hallway. He shoved me into a spare guest room. The space was completely devoid of personality or comfort. It contained a single mattress wrapped in sterile white sheets, a minimalist metal desk, and bare walls. It was a holding cell disguised as luxury real estate. Colin pointed a harsh finger at my chest. He dropped his fake concern entirely. He informed me that the multi-million-dollar acquisition of my diagnostic application was happening immediately. He demanded the master administrative passwords to the primary hosting platform. He warned me that any defiance, any attempt to stall or sabotage the transfer would result in severe, highly unpleasant consequences. Kendra leaned against the doorframe, sipping her vodka, her eyes hard and evaluating. They viewed me as nothing more than a stubborn combination lock standing between them and a massive payout. They needed the keys to pay off their $3 million syndicate debt, and their desperation practically radiated off them in frantic waves. Colin slammed his hand against the metal desk, shouting at me to stop staring and provide the login credentials. He shoved a sleek silver laptop toward me, the screen glowing brightly with the hosting platform's login portal. I did not flinch when Colin struck the desk. I processed his anger as a predictable variable in my calculated algorithm. I stepped forward and placed my hands on the cold aluminum chassis of his laptop. I did not argue, delay, or negotiate. I simply looked at the login screen and began to type. The mechanical feedback of the shallow keyboard felt inferior to my custom setup at home, but it functioned adequately for the task. I entered the lengthy alphanumeric string of the master administrative password. I pressed the enter key. The screen transitioned, instantly bypassing the security firewalls and loading the primary dashboard of the diagnostic application. The interface bloomed across the monitor in vibrant colors displaying complex user metrics, active server nodes, and the sleek aesthetic framework I had meticulously designed. I stood up and took a step back, gesturing toward the screen. I told Colin he now possessed full administrative control. I calmly explained that he had the highest level of clearance, granting him the total ability to transfer ownership rights, alter the codebase, and finalize the pending corporate acquisition. Colin practically lunged forward, shoving me aside to take the seat at the metal desk. His eyes widened as he stared at the dashboard, completely mesmerized by the digital display. He rapidly clicked through the menus, verifying the administrative privileges and confirming his newly acquired total control. He breathed a heavy sigh of absolute relief, his shoulders dropping as the lethal tension of his mafia debt momentarily eased. He genuinely believed he had just successfully hijacked my entire life's work. I watched him navigate the interface, maintaining a perfectly blank expression. I offered absolutely zero resistance, feeding his overwhelming arrogance exactly what it craved. Colin laughed aloud, a sharp, manic sound echoing off the bare walls of the guest room. He spun the laptop around to show Kendra the glowing dashboard. He openly gloated, mocking my grandfather's pathetic legal strategy and my own supposed submission. He called me a compliant, useful idiot. Kendra smiled, taking a long sip of her drink, the looming threat of the Chicago syndicate finally lifting from her shoulders. They celebrated their brilliant heist, entirely unaware they had just taken legal ownership of a beautifully designed, completely empty shell. The vibrant charts and active server nodes displayed on the screen were perfectly rendered illusions. The actual revolutionary algorithm, the true diagnostic engine that held the genuine monetary value, remained securely locked away on my encrypted offline drive back in my grandfather's basement. Colin was staring at a worthless digital ghost. Driven by arrogant momentum and a desperate need for immediate cash, Colin pulled his phone from his pocket. He immediately dialed the lead legal counsel for the Silicon Valley Tech Corporation. He placed the call on speakerphone, wanting to flaunt his victory. He proudly announced to the corporate executives that the minor custody dispute was officially resolved by a family court judge. He declared himself the active legal guardian and the sole proprietor of the intellectual property. He stared directly at me as he instructed the tech corporation to resume the $7.5 million acquisition immediately. He demanded they send the final transfer documents and initiate the technical audit to close the deal by the end of the week. He hung up the phone, a victorious sneer plastered across his face. He locked the guest room door from the outside, leaving me perfectly positioned to watch his entire world spectacularly implode. The arrival of the Silicon Valley executives transformed the sterile penthouse into a high-stakes corporate boardroom. 3 sharply dressed venture capitalists stepped out of the private elevator carrying sleek silver briefcases and radiating an aura of calculated skepticism. Colin immediately shifted into his carefully practiced persona of a visionary tech incubator. He plastered a brilliant, welcoming smile across his face and offered firm, confident handshakes. Kendra stood beside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, draped in an elegant designer dress, flawlessly playing the role of the deeply concerned protective mother who had just rescued her brilliant son from a tyrannical environment. They ushered the executives toward the sprawling marble dining table, treating the entire interaction like a triumphant victory lap. The lead executive, a severe woman with piercing eyes, did not return their enthusiastic smiles. She demanded absolute reassurance that the messy, highly publicized family court dispute was entirely resolved. Colin smoothly produced the official court order bearing the judge's signature. He confidently assured the corporate team that Kendra held full, uncontested emergency guardianship. He explicitly stated that all intellectual property rights previously claimed by a delusional elderly grandfather were entirely nullified. Through the thin drywall of the locked guest room, the muffled sounds of their corporate theater echoed clearly. Colin lied effortlessly, weaving a beautiful narrative about utilizing the acquisition funds to secure a lifetime of specialized medical care for his autistic stepson. He painted himself as a noble savior while actively plotting to use the buyout money to save his own skin from a violent Chicago crime syndicate. The executives nodded, meticulously reviewing the legal paperwork. They completely bought into the polished illusion, completely unaware that the revolutionary software they were about to purchase was nothing more than a hollow, digitally engineered ghost. The lead executive opened her briefcase and extracted a massive stack of heavily watermarked legal documents. These papers constituted the official intellectual property transfer agreement, the binding contract that would surrender every single line of Jayden's code to the tech corporation in exchange for $7.5 million. Colin's eyes locked onto the crisp pages with a ravenous, desperate hunger. The paper represented his immediate survival. Kendra took a seat at the head of the marble table. The executive handed her a heavy gold pen clearly explaining the immense legal weight of the transaction. By signing the documents, Kendra was legally swearing under penalty of federal fraud that she possessed the authentic, fully functional application and held the unencumbered right to sell it. She did not hesitate for a single second. She did not read the dense liability clauses or the strict technical warranties. She simply gripped the pen and rapidly signed her name across the bottom of every designated page. She acted as the absolute legal guardian, confidently selling away a masterpiece she did not understand and had absolutely no part in creating. With every stroke of the pen, Kendra permanently trapped herself. She was officially committing massive corporate fraud on the highest legal level, actively selling a worthless dummy server disguised as a revolutionary medical tool. Colin watched the final signature with bated breath. A profound, visible wave of relief washed over his entire body. The suffocating terror of the mafia death threat momentarily evaporated from his mind. He genuinely believed he had just successfully executed the perfect digital heist. He envisioned the millions hitting his bank account, completely oblivious to the fact that his arrogant signature had just sealed his inevitable destruction. The lead executive gathered the signed transfer agreements and slid them carefully back into her silver briefcase. The massive transaction was officially authorized, but the corporate machinery harbored one final, non-negotiable safeguard. The executive looked directly at Colin and plainly stated that the corporation was immediately triggering a mandatory 72-hour technical audit period. The $7.5 million would remain securely locked in an escrow account until their elite team of software engineers thoroughly verified the code architecture. They needed to absolutely guarantee the application functioned flawlessly before releasing a single cent of the buyout funds. A microscopic flicker of panic flashed across Colin's eyes. He had desperately anticipated an instant, unrestricted wire transfer. The violent Chicago syndicate had given him a strict 30-day deadline, and the clock was ticking relentlessly. However, Colin quickly masked his anxiety behind a smooth, accommodating smile. He rapidly calculated the time frame in his head. 72 hours was a painful delay, but it fell well within the mafia's lethal deadline. He enthusiastically agreed to the audit, confidently granting the corporate engineers remote access to the primary hosting platform. He handed over the master administrative passwords Jayden had provided earlier that afternoon. Colin was absolutely certain the code was perfect because he had watched Jayden log into the system with his own eyes. He had no idea he had just handed a team of elite Silicon Valley engineers the keys to a completely empty digital room. The executive stood up, shook hands with the deceitful couple, and promised to finalize the wire transfer the exact moment the technical inspection concluded. The trap was now fully armed. The corporate engineers were about to discover the massive fraud, and Colin had legally provided all the evidence required to secure his own federal indictment. The private elevator doors slid shut, carrying the tech executives away and leaving the penthouse in absolute silence. The second the heavy locks engaged, Colin unleashed a loud, victorious shout. He marched to the kitchen island and aggressively popped the cork off a chilled bottle of expensive champagne. He poured 2 massive glasses, handing one to Kendra with a wide, arrogant grin. They aggressively clinked their glasses together openly, celebrating their brilliant escape from the Chicago syndicate. The alcohol flowed quickly as they completely dropped their guarded parental masks. Colin loudly mocked the corporate executives for being so easily manipulated. Kendra laughed casually, discussing their immediate plans to wire the $3 million to the mob bosses and instantly flee the state, permanently abandoning Jayden the second the escrow funds cleared. They sank into the plush leather sofas, thoroughly intoxicated by their false victory and the expensive champagne. Their vigilance completely evaporated. Meanwhile, down the dark hallway inside the stark, locked guest room, the brilliant architect of their downfall was already moving. Jayden had not been disarmed when Colin confiscated his cell phone. He slowly raised his left arm. Strapped to his wrist was a heavily customized smartwatch, a device Colin had completely ignored, assuming it was a simple digital timepiece. Jayden tapped the small glass screen, activating a specialized wireless overriding protocol he had engineered months ago. The watch silently interfaced with the penthouse's sophisticated smart home network. Code cascaded across the tiny screen as Jaden methodically bypassed the local security firewalls. He isolated the electronic lock securing his bedroom door and transmitted a direct override command. A soft, barely audible metallic click echoed in the silent room. The heavy deadbolt disengaged. Jaden lowered his wrist and gripped the door handle, holding the absolute power to walk out of his cage while his captors blindly celebrated their own impending doom. Jaden pushed the heavy wooden door of the guest room open. The hinges moved in absolute silence. He stepped into the plush hallway of the penthouse. The air smelled strongly of spilled champagne and expensive cologne. Colin and Kendra were completely passed out on the living room sofas. Empty crystal glasses sat dangerously close to the edge of the glass coffee table. Jaden did not look at them. They were no longer relevant variables in his immediate equation. He moved with total calculated calm. He bypassed the main living area and approached the private elevator. The biometric scanner glowed red, requiring a registered fingerprint to descend. Jaden simply raised his wrist. He activated a secondary script on his smartwatch, cloning the access frequency he had captured earlier when Colin swiped them upstairs. The scanner blinked green. The steel doors parted instantly. Jaden stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor lobby. The descent took exactly 42 seconds. The night security guard was asleep behind the marble reception desk. Jaden walked right past him and pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors. The frigid 2 o'clock morning air hit his face. The city streets were entirely desolate. Neon streetlights reflected off the damp pavement. A normal teenager would feel terrified walking alone through the downtown core in the middle of the night. Jaden felt nothing but profound clarity. The chaotic, unpredictable energy of his mother and her desperate husband was gone. He was back in a highly structured environment governed by predictable logic. He walked exactly 3 blocks north to a designated transit hub he had mapped out in his mind on the drive over. He stood under the flickering light of a bus shelter and waited for the final piece of his extraction protocol. A yellow night shift taxi turned the corner, its headlights cutting through the dense city fog. Jaden stepped off the curb and raised his hand. The battered sedan pulled over. Jaden climbed into the back seat and recited my exact home address to the exhausted driver. He handed the man a crisp $50 bill he had hidden inside his shoe for this precise contingency. The driver nodded, asked absolutely no questions, and merged back onto the empty interstate. The journey took 25 minutes. Jaden watched the towering glass skyscrapers give way to the familiar quiet streets of our suburban neighborhood. The taxi stopped at the end of my driveway. Jaden exited the vehicle and walked up the concrete path. He did not need to knock. I was already standing in the entryway. I had not slept a single second. I had spent the entire night tracking his smartwatch GPS beacon, watching a tiny green dot move across my computer monitor from the penthouse to my front door. I pulled the heavy door open before his foot touched the top porch step. Jaden walked inside. I dropped to my knees and pulled him into a fierce, silent embrace. My massive frame shook with an overwhelming wave of relief. He patted my shoulder twice, his rigid way of acknowledging the emotional weight of the moment. We did not speak. Words were entirely unnecessary. The hardest part of the backward gambit was officially over. He had walked directly into the center of the tiger's den, delivered the poisoned bait, and walked out completely unharmed. I stood up and locked the deadbolt. The digital trap was fully operational, and my grandson was safely back behind my walls. We moved to the kitchen to wait for the inevitable explosion. Dawn broke over the city's skyline, casting harsh, unforgiving rays of light into the luxury penthouse. Kendra groaned, dragging herself up from the leather sofa. A severe champagne hangover pounded against her temples. She rubbed her dry eyes and looked around the massive living room. Colin was still snoring loudly on the adjacent couch, his arm draped over the edge. The reality of their situation rushed back into her mind. They had the signed intellectual property transfer. They were just days away from a multi-million-dollar payout and total freedom from the Chicago syndicate. Kendra walked toward the kitchen island to pour a glass of water. She glanced down the long, stark white hallway. A sharp jolt of raw panic instantly sobered her. The heavy wooden door to the guest room was standing wide open. Kendra dropped her glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. She sprinted down the hallway and burst into the room. The sterile white mattress was completely empty. Jaden was gone. Kendra spun around her, breathing rapid and shallow. She checked the adjoining bathroom, the closets, and the balcony. Nothing. She ran back into the living room and kicked the side of the sofa, jolting Colin awake. She screamed that the boy was missing. Colin shot up, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute terror. He scrambled to his feet and checked the front door. The smart lock had been cleanly bypassed. The security logs showed no forced entry. Colin gripped his hair, completely losing his mind. If Jaden was gone, the tech corporation would find out. If the tech executives realized the custody agreement was compromised, they would instantly terminate the audit and pull the escrow funds. The Chicago Mafia deadline was ticking, and their only leverage had just evaporated into thin air. Colin paced the penthouse like a trapped animal. He cursed violently, throwing empty champagne flutes against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He screamed that the syndicate would skin them alive if the tech deal collapsed. Kendra did not waste time throwing tantrums. Her survival instincts took total control. She understood that whoever controlled the narrative controlled the outcome. She knew exactly where Jaden had gone, and she knew she had to destroy me before I could expose their massive fraud to the corporate auditors. Kendra grabbed her cell phone from the kitchen counter and immediately dialed 911. She forced hyperventilation into her chest, manufacturing a tone of sheer, absolute hysteria. When the emergency dispatcher answered, Kendra shrieked into the receiver. She claimed her severely delusional, dangerous father had completely snapped. She lied with chilling conviction, stating, "I had tracked them to their secure building, bypassed the locks, and forcefully abducted her autistic son in the middle of the night." She explicitly told the dispatcher that I was heavily armed, deeply unstable, and entirely capable of a murder-suicide. She demanded a full, tactical police response. Across the city, I stood in my kitchen pouring a fresh cup of coffee for myself and a glass of orange juice for Jaden. The morning air was quiet, but the peace was violently fragile. A low, piercing wail broke the suburban silence. The sound multiplied rapidly. Within seconds, the distant wail morphed into a deafening chorus of police sirens tearing down the interstate, heading directly toward my neighborhood. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the trees at the end of my street. The endgame had officially commenced. I set my coffee mug down on the counter, squared my shoulders, and prepared to face the storm. The deafening roar of sirens shattered the early morning tranquility of my suburban street. 4 heavily marked police cruisers careened around the corner, their tires squealing violently against the damp asphalt. They swerved in an aggressive, synchronized maneuver, completely boxing in my old truck and tearing up the front lawn. The rapid deployment signaled a high-risk tactical response. Kendra had deliberately painted me as a deranged armed kidnapper on the emergency dispatch call, and the local precinct had mobilized accordingly. Doors flew open before the vehicles even fully halted. A dozen officers poured out their expressions, taut with pure adrenaline. Several drew their service weapons, aiming the barrels squarely at my chest, while others unclipped heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. The lead captain shouted rapid, booming commands, ordering me to step away from the threshold and place my hands clearly behind my head. They moved with a frantic urgency, fully expecting to confront a hostile, psychotic grandfather holding a special needs child hostage. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with their shouted instructions. I maintained absolute disciplined stillness on my front porch. Inside the house, safely shielded behind the thick oak door, Jaden continued eating his breakfast, completely unbothered by the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the living room walls. The officers stormed the concrete steps, closing the distance in seconds. 2 patrolmen flanked me, gripping my shoulders with harsh, bruising force to spin me around. The cold metal of the handcuffs hovered inches from my wrists. Kendra and Colin pulled up in their luxury SUV, parking erratically behind the blockade of police cruisers. Kendra immediately threw her car door open and pointed a trembling, manicured finger at my face, screaming at the captain to arrest me and rescue her son. Before the heavy steel cuffs could snap shut around my wrists, a sharp, commanding voice sliced through the chaotic shouting. Nolan stepped smoothly out of the deep shadows of the wraparound porch. He had parked his car 2 streets over before dawn, anticipating this exact hysterical escalation from Kendra. My attorney did not look like a man facing an armed police standoff. He wore an immaculately tailored suit and carried his heavy leather briefcase with absolute, unshakable confidence. He walked directly into the center of the tactical formation, completely ignoring the drawn weapons and the aggressive posturing of the patrolmen. Nolan locked eyes with the police captain and raised a single commanding hand to halt the arrest. He reached into his breast pocket and extracted a thick, heavily textured parchment document. He unfolded the crisp paper with deliberate slowness and thrust it directly against the captain's tactical vest. The document bore a massive, embossed red seal of the federal court, its stark lettering demanding immediate legal compliance. Nolan instructed the captain to read the highlighted injunction before he made a catastrophic, career-ending jurisdictional error. The captain frowned, his aggressive demeanor faltering as he scanned the heavily authorized paperwork. The tension on the porch shifted instantly. The patrolmen gripping my shoulders loosened their hold, looking to their commanding officer for guidance. Kendra shrieked from the street, demanding to know why the police were hesitating to arrest a kidnapper. Nolan completely ignored her frantic performance. He kept his piercing gaze fixed on the captain, pointing a manicured finger at the federal judge's signature at the bottom of the page. The captain lowered his radio, his face draining of color as the immense legal reality of the document finally registered in his mind. Nolan turned his back on the police captain and faced my daughter, who was desperately trying to push past the barricade of squad cars. He raised his voice, ensuring his words echoed clearly across the dew-covered lawn for every officer and neighbor to hear. He delivered the lethal truth we had kept entirely buried during the family court charade. 8 years ago, immediately following Kendra's total unapologetic abandonment of her special needs son, I did not simply wait for her to return. I hired elite legal counsel and filed a massive, heavily documented petition in federal court. I sued for permanent, irrevocable sole guardianship based on severe neglect and total maternal desertion. A federal judge had reviewed the overwhelming evidence of her absence and granted my petition in its entirety. The resulting ruling permanently stripped Kendra of all parental rights and completely sealed the records to protect Jaden's privacy. Nolan explained to the stunned police captain that the preliminary custody hearing Kendra won yesterday was a complete, legally void farce. The family court judge who awarded her temporary custody had absolutely zero jurisdiction to overturn a sealed federal mandate. Kendra had maliciously weaponized her original birth certificate, a document that had possessed absolutely zero legal authority for nearly a decade. She was not a desperate mother attempting to rescue her child. She was a legally unrecognized stranger attempting to commit a brazen, highly coordinated kidnapping through the manipulation of a lower municipal court. The police captain signaled his men to immediately release my arms. They stepped backward, holstering their weapons as the full scope of Kendra's massive legal deception became undeniably clear. Her entire victim narrative disintegrated into dust upon contact with the absolute federally certified truth. The crushing weight of her magnificent failure struck Kendra all at once. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed heavily against the side of a marked police cruiser, gasping for air as her perfectly constructed maternal illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The realization that she held absolutely zero legal power to extract Jaden from my home broke her completely. She looked up at Colin, her eyes wide with the sheer terror of the unpayable Chicago syndicate debt hanging over their heads. Colin did not rush to comfort his wife. Instead, he threw his head back and unleashed a loud, arrogant laugh. He stared at me across the flashing police lights with a look of absolute unbothered superiority. Colin stepped forward mockingly, clapping his hands together. He arrogantly declared that my brilliant federal guardianship maneuver was entirely irrelevant. He boasted that the custody issue no longer mattered because the massive intellectual property transaction was already finalized. Colin tapped his suit pocket, proudly announcing that he held the signed, legally binding contract transferring Jaden's software to the Silicon Valley Tech Corporation for $7.5 million. He claimed the 72-hour technical audit was already rapidly progressing and the escrow funds would clear regardless of who held physical custody of the boy. He believed his signature on the corporate documents completely insulated him from the mob bosses. His triumphant laughter echoed down the quiet suburban street, completely masking the deep hum of heavy engines approaching from the main intersection. 3 massive, heavily armored black SUVs turned the corner with military precision. They completely bypassed the local police blockade, pulling up directly behind Colin's rented vehicle. The situation instantly escalated beyond local law enforcement. The real consequences of Colin's fraudulent corporate heist had finally arrived to collect their due. The heavy doors of the 3 armored SUVs swung open in unison. The unmistakable sound of military-grade hinges breaking the morning silence caused the local police officers to instantly lower their radios. 4 men stepped out onto the damp asphalt, their boots hitting the ground with heavy authority. 2 of them wore immaculately tailored charcoal suits carrying the identical silver briefcases I had seen through the guest room camera feed just hours prior. These were the lead attorneys for the Silicon Valley Tech Corporation. Flanking them were 2 imposing figures in tactical windbreakers bearing the stark yellow letters of the FBI. These were federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division, and their sudden presence instantly elevated the scene from a chaotic domestic dispute to a high-level federal incident. Colin adjusted his suit jacket, his arrogant grin widening across his face. He fundamentally misread the entire situation. His desperate, greed-addled brain convinced him the tech executives had arrived to personally expedite the escrow release due to the sheer brilliance of the software. He completely ignored the federal agents. He stepped away from the local police cruisers and walked directly toward the corporate attorneys, with his hand confidently extended. He loudly welcomed them to the neighborhood, boasting that the minor family misunderstanding was already handled and the asset was fully secure. The local police captain stepped back, recognizing the federal jurisdiction, and ordered his patrolman to stand down. Kendra remained frozen against the side of the squad car. Her survival instincts screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. The lead corporate attorney did not take Colin's extended hand. He did not smile. He completely ignored Colin's enthusiastic greeting and marched right past him, his eyes locked dead ahead. The two FBI agents moved in perfect synchronization, boxing Colin in and physically blocking him from retreating toward his rented vehicle. The corporate attorney walked directly toward where I stood with Nolan on the porch, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute fury. The corporate lawyer stopped directly in front of my rusted pickup truck. He raised his heavy silver briefcase and snapped the latches open with a sharp metallic crack that cut through the tense suburban air. He extracted a thick stack of legal documents. I immediately recognized the heavy watermarks and the dense paragraphs of the intellectual property transfer agreement. He turned on his heel, locked his piercing gaze onto Colin and Kendra, and violently slammed the massive contract onto the metal hood of my truck. The booming sound echoed across the front lawn, making Kendra physically flinch and draw back against the police cruiser. He pointed a rigid finger at the bottom of the visible pages, specifically highlighting the fresh, frantic signatures Kendra had provided just hours ago in the penthouse. He spoke with a cold, lethal precision. He stated that Kendra had legally presented herself as the sole authorized guardian and proprietor of the diagnostic software. He reminded them that by signing this specific federal document, she had sworn under penalty of perjury, wire fraud, and corporate espionage that the asset was fully functional and entirely unencumbered. Colin's arrogant smile finally began to waver. He stepped forward, his voice defensively loud, demanding to know why the corporation was bringing federal agents to a simple software acquisition. He arrogantly insisted that the contract was legally binding and demanded the immediate release of his $7.5 million. He cited the 72-hour audit, claiming the funds were guaranteed and the transaction was locked. The corporate lawyer placed his hand flat against the signed documents on the truck hood. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing octave. He informed Colin that the contract was indeed legally binding, which was precisely why Colin and his wife were currently facing decades in federal prison. The lawyer declared that the mandatory technical audit had been expedited by their elite engineering team the exact minute Colin had handed over the master passwords. The corporate attorney delivered the lethal blow with absolute merciless clarity. He announced that the highly anticipated technical audit had lasted exactly 14 minutes before the entire system catastrophically failed. The tech corporation's elite software engineers had logged into the primary hosting platform using the administrative credentials Colin had so proudly provided. They easily bypassed the initial firewalls and accessed the central dashboard. However, the moment they attempted to run a basic diagnostic simulation, the application crashed completely. The lawyer slammed his hand against the truck hood again, his voice rising in controlled fury. He stated that the beautiful, vibrant user interface Colin had sold them was nothing more than a digitally engineered mirage. The groundbreaking artificial intelligence algorithm, the revolutionary machine learning core that actively diagnosed medical anomalies and generated the entire $7.5 million valuation, simply did not exist within the transferred code. Colin had confidently sold them a hollow, perfectly painted digital shell. He had handed over the keys to an empty room. The lawyer systematically detailed the massive extent of the fraud. There were no proprietary databases. There were no active machine learning models. The server nodes were dead loops designed to look active only on the surface dashboard. The corporation had frozen the escrow account immediately. The funds Colin desperately needed to pay off his lethal $3 million Chicago syndicate debt were permanently locked behind a wall of federal investigations. The lawyer stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest. He stated that the corporation was officially pressing charges for massive intellectual property fraud and attempting to extort a major tech firm through deep-faked assets. The trap I had painstakingly built in my basement had snapped shut with devastating perfection. I had let them steal the exact mechanism of their own destruction, and they had legally signed their names to the crime. The collapse in the core, Colin's arrogant grin completely shattered. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His knees buckled slightly as the absolute reality of his situation crushed the air from his lungs. The $7.5 million was gone. The corporate bailout was entirely dead. The Chicago Mafia's 30-day deadline was rapidly approaching, and he now had absolutely zero leverage, zero cash, and a massive federal fraud indictment hanging directly over his head. He looked at Kendra, but she was completely unresponsive, staring blankly at the signed contract on the hood of the truck. Her magnificent courtroom performance had officially secured her a federal prison sentence. Colin opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless stammer escaped his lips. He raised his hands frantically, trying to claim he was also a victim, that he had been tricked by a deceptive teenager and a vindictive old man. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, cutting off Colin's desperate, pathetic lies. The agent placed his hand heavily on Colin's shoulder, a clear physical warning not to move a single inch. The agent looked at the corporate lawyer, then turned his intense, evaluating gaze toward the front porch, where Nolan and I stood in perfect, disciplined silence. The federal agent pointed at the worthless contract on the truck hood. He stated that a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence algorithm does not simply vanish into thin air. He demanded to know who actually possessed the true codebase. He demanded to know who held the authentic legal ownership of the core algorithm. Nolan stepped forward, his leather briefcase gleaming in the morning sun. He looked directly at the federal agents, then down at the ruined, terrified faces of Colin and Kendra. Nolan smiled, delivering a sharp, predatory expression. He calmly announced that the true algorithm had never left this property. Nolan's declaration hangs in the crisp morning air, freezing the blood in Colin's veins. I stepped down from the wooden porch, my heavy work boots crunching loudly against the gravel driveway. The two FBI agents instinctively shift their stances, but I do not present a threat. I am simply a man arriving at the absolute culmination of a 9-year protective strategy. Nolan falls in step beside me, opening his leather briefcase with a sharp, satisfying click. He extracts a heavy, rigid manila envelope and hands it directly to me. I walk past the line of confused local police officers and stop right at the front bumper of my rusted pickup truck. The corporate lawyer watches me with intensely narrowed eyes. I pull 2 thick, professionally laminated documents from the envelope. I do not shout. I do not gloat. I move with the methodical precision of a mechanic executing a perfect engine rebuild. I place the documents flat on the cold metal hood of my truck, positioning them exactly next to the massive, fraudulent contract Kendra signed just hours ago. The visual contrast is striking. Her document is a desperate, unverified lie built on a temporary family court order. My documents are pristine, bearing raised federal watermarks and absolute legal authority. The lead corporate attorney steps forward, adjusting his glasses to inspect the papers. The FBI agents lean in closely behind him. I tap my calloused index finger directly onto the bold black ink of the official state registration and copyright certificates. I announce that the true, fully functional diagnostic algorithm is securely housed on an encrypted offline server bolted into the concrete foundation of my basement. The silence on the street deepens. Colin stares at the laminated papers, his jaw trembling uncontrollably as his entire reality violently unravels. The corporate lawyer picks up the top document, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal text. He reads the official state seal and the federal tax identification numbers aloud. 3 years ago, when Jaden first compiled the raw, preliminary framework of his medical diagnostic tool, I recognized the terrifying magnitude of his creation. I knew instantly that his genius would eventually attract ruthless predators looking for an easy, highly profitable target. I did not rely on hope or blind faith to protect my grandson. I liquidated my entire life savings from 4 decades of running a mechanic shop and hired a premier corporate law firm. I legally incorporated Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC. I secured every trademark, every patent, and every shred of intellectual property rights before Jaden even finished writing the beta version of his code. The corporate attorney reads the registration details clearly for the federal agents to hear. I am explicitly listed as the sole registered chief executive officer. I am the primary controlling shareholder. The corporate entity is locked behind an impenetrable fortress of legal safeguards specifically designed to repel hostile takeovers. Colin's face contorts into a mask of pure desperation. He points a shaking finger at Kendra, loudly protesting that she is the biological mother. He frantically argues that family court grants her the absolute right to manage her minor son's assets. He demands the tech executives ignore the LLC and honor the $7.5 million contract she just signed. The FBI agents look at Colin with profound disgust, entirely unfazed by his pathetic, legally ignorant outburst. The corporate attorney carefully sets the registration document back onto the hood of my truck. He turns to Colin and states that biology has absolutely zero standing in federal corporate law. Nolan steps forward seamlessly, taking control of the legal execution. He pulls a secondary stack of payroll documents from his briefcase and hands them directly to the federal agents. He explains that Jaden does not operate as an independent minor child tinkering with code in his bedroom. Jaden is a formally contracted W-2 salaried lead engineer explicitly employed by Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC. Every single line of code Jaden writes is executed on company-owned hardware during company-designated hours. He receives a generous monthly salary which is automatically deposited into an impenetrable, legally protected trust fund that matures when he turns 21. Nolan highlights the standard corporate employment clauses explicitly printed on the second page of the documents. Under established corporate law, any and all intellectual property developed by a salaried employee belongs exclusively and permanently to the corporation itself. The algorithm never belonged to Jaden personally. It certainly never belonged to Kendra. It is the exclusive, unassailable property of my corporation. Kendra stares at the payroll documents in absolute horror. Her hands grip the edge of the police cruiser to keep from collapsing onto the damp grass. She finally realizes that the temporary family court order she so maliciously secured gave her absolutely nothing. Taking physical custody of Jaden did not give her custody of the algorithm. She had spent weeks orchestrating a massive, highly publicized legal strike just to steal an employee from my company. She possesses no shares, no administrative rights, and absolutely no legal authority to sell a single piece of the technology. The entire premise of their multi-million-dollar heist was built on a fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of corporate structure. The lead FBI agent steps away from the truck, his posture shifting from observational to entirely hostile. He locks his eyes directly onto Colin. The situation has instantly mutated from a messy municipal custody dispute into a major federal incident. The agent plainly states the devastating reality of their actions. Kendra and Colin did not simply attempt to sell a minor child's personal hobby project. By signing that massive intellectual property transfer agreement in the penthouse, they actively and fraudulently attempted to sell a corporate asset they had absolutely no legal right to touch. They falsely presented themselves as authorized proprietors of Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC, to a major Silicon Valley corporation. The corporate attorney crosses his arms, his voice dripping with lethal professional fury. He announces that his firm is officially pressing federal charges for corporate espionage, grand theft, and massive wire fraud. The crime carries mandatory minimum sentences that stretch into decades. Colin stumbles backward, his chest heaving with sheer panic. He is completely trapped between two inescapable walls of destruction. The federal government is about to seize his assets and lock him in a penitentiary, and the violent Chicago syndicate is still actively waiting to collect a $3 million debt he can no longer pay. The mob bosses do not care about corporate law or failed acquisitions. They only care about their money, and Colin just lost his only lifeline. The FBI agent unclips his radio, requesting 2 transport vans to my address immediately. He pulls a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt and steps directly toward Colin. The trap has snapped completely shut, securing the predators exactly where they belong. The lead corporate attorney reaches back into his silver briefcase. He does not pull out a retraction or a negotiation parameter. He pulls out a thick, heavily bound legal dossier. He steps directly into Colin's personal space and shoves the heavy stack of papers hard against Colin's chest. Colin instinctively brings his hands up to catch it. The lawyer states clearly that this constitutes formal service of a massive civil lawsuit. The Silicon Valley firm is suing them both personally and jointly for gross misrepresentation, tortious interference, and corporate sabotage. They intentionally deceived a publicly traded entity. The lawyer explains the unforgiving mechanics of corporate vengeance. When a tech giant mobilizes an elite acquisition team, freezes escrow accounts, and initiates intense legal audits, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars in billable hours. Kendra and Colin wasted their time, insulted their intelligence, and aggressively attempted to fence stolen corporate property. The tech firm does not simply cancel fraudulent contracts and walk away. They completely annihilate the fraudsters to set a terrifying legal precedent. Kendra stares at the thick lawsuit in Colin's trembling hands. Her knees give out completely. She slides down the side of the police cruiser, hitting the damp pavement with a dull thud. The pristine designer dress she meticulously selected to project maternal innocence is now soaked in mud and morning dew. She looks up at the towering lawyer, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. She begs him to understand that she was just trying to help her struggling son. The lawyer looks down at her with absolute disgust. He states that a mother protecting her son does not sign away his life's work for a personal payday. The corporate attorney leans over Kendra, pointing a sharp finger directly at the specific liability clauses buried deep within the signed transfer agreement. He explains the brutal mechanics of the breach of contract penalty she eagerly authorized. The document she signed in the penthouse contained standard non-negotiable punitive measures for fraudulent misrepresentation. By attempting to sell an asset they did not legally own, they triggered an immediate catastrophic financial penalty. The contract demands exactly $15 million in immediate liquid damages. Colin drops the dossier onto the driveway as if the paper itself is burning his skin. He screams that he does not have $15 million. He screams that he does not even have a fraction of that amount. The lawyer stands perfectly straight and adjusts his suit jacket with chilling composure. He states that the corporation is fully aware of their extreme financial insolvency. The tech firm's forensic accountants have already mapped Colin's personal and business accounts. They know all about the suffocating $3 million debt to the violent Chicago syndicate. They know about his maxed-out credit lines and his impending bankruptcy. The lawyer explains that the $15 million judgment is not about collecting cash. It is about establishing absolute legal dominance. The corporation will seize Colin's remaining assets, liquidate his business holdings, garnish any future wages, and permanently block him from ever participating in the financial sector again. They will dismantle his life piece by piece until the debt is fully satisfied. Colin's chest heaves violently. He claws at his own necktie, desperately trying to loosen the suffocating knot. The illusion of his wealthy, sophisticated lifestyle has entirely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, penniless man staring directly into the abyss of absolute ruin. The lead corporate attorney steps back, yielding the floor entirely to the federal authorities. The two FBI agents from the Financial Crimes Division move forward in absolute synchronization. Their tactical boots crunch loudly against the gravel. The lead agent grabs Colin's wrists and violently twists them behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs snap shut with a sharp, definitive click that echoes across the quiet suburban lawn. The agent leans close to Colin's ear and officially reads him his Miranda rights. The words hit the damp morning air with terrifying finality. Colin is officially under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate espionage, and interstate financial extortion. The agent explains the severe reality of the charges. Colin utilized telecommunication networks across state lines to execute a multi-million-dollar fraudulent transaction. He actively conspired to extort a major corporation using stolen intellectual property. These are not minor local offenses that can be negotiated down or dismissed in a municipal family court. These are severe federal felonies carrying mandatory minimum sentences in a maximum security penitentiary. Colin struggles weakly against the FBI agent's grip, his expensive suit wrinkling as he is physically subdued. He looks toward the local police officers, begging them to intervene, claiming this is simply a terrible misunderstanding over a minor family dispute. The local police captain crosses his arms and turns his head away, completely washing his hands of the situation. Colin is no longer a local problem. He is a federal prisoner. The second FBI agent grabs Colin by the shoulder and forces him toward the waiting black transport van. The heavy metal door slides open, revealing a dark, caged interior waiting to swallow him whole. The overwhelming, suffocating pressure of simultaneous financial ruin and federal incarceration instantly shatters their alliance. There is zero loyalty among predators when the trap finally snaps shut. Colin digs his heels into the driveway, refusing to step into the transport van. He twists his head around and screams directly at Kendra. He blames her for the entire catastrophe. He shouts to the federal agents that the fraudulent software heist was entirely Kendra's idea. He claims she orchestrated the fake maternal concern, manipulated the family court judge with manufactured tears, and physically forced him to sign the corporate documents. He declares he was simply a desperate husband trying to support his wife's legal rights. Kendra scrambles up from the muddy grass, her face contorted in absolute venomous rage. She points a shaking finger at Colin and screams that he is a pathetic, manipulative liar. She loudly confesses to the FBI agents that Colin owes $3 million to a violent Chicago mob syndicate. She declares that Colin planned the entire intellectual property theft solely to save his own life from mafia hitmen. She insists she was terrified of his syndicate connections and only cooperated because he threatened her physical safety. They stand in my driveway, viciously tearing each other apart, loudly broadcasting their darkest, most lethal secrets to a team of federal agents actively taking notes. They have entirely done my job for me. They have handed the FBI a perfectly wrapped, verbally confessed conspiracy case on a silver platter. I stand on my wooden porch with Nolan by my side, watching the spectacular total destruction of the people who tried to destroy my grandson. I do not feel joy. I feel the profound silent satisfaction of a deeply structured equation executing a flawless, inevitable conclusion. The cold steel of the FBI handcuffs bites brutally into Colin's wrists. The federal agent shoves him firmly against the reinforced side panel of the black transport van. The physical impact shatters the very last fraction of Colin's arrogant composure. He thrashes against the agent's grip, his expensive suit tearing at the shoulder seam. He snaps his head toward Kendra and initiates a total, unhinged betrayal. He screams at the top of his lungs, explicitly detailing her role as the sole mastermind of the entire fraudulent operation. He insists he is merely a naive victim of her sophisticated psychological manipulation. Colin loudly confesses that the agonizing courtroom performance was entirely scripted. He reveals that Kendra spent the past 4 months meticulously researching my late wife's medical records. She utilized that private stolen medical history to perfectly mimic symptoms of generational trauma, weaponizing a dead woman's genuine struggles to manipulate the family court judge. He declares that Kendra personally hired the dark web contractor to generate the deep-faked abuse photographs. He insists she forced him to participate in the intellectual property theft under extreme emotional duress. He claims she threatened to ruin his corporate reputation with false domestic violence allegations if he refused to broker the multi-million-dollar tech deal. Colin begs the lead federal agent for a plea bargain, offering to testify against his wife in exchange for total immunity. His voice cracks into a pathetic, high-pitched whine as he tries to sell his fabricated innocence. He completely throws the woman he married to the federal wolves, prioritizing his own immediate survival over their shattered alliance. Kendra's pristine facade utterly incinerates. The sheer audacity of Colin's cowardly accusations triggers a violent, visceral reaction. She lets out a guttural shriek that strips the vocal cords in her throat. She lunges across the damp gravel driveway, completely ignoring the shouted commands of the local police officers. She closes the distance before the nearest patrolman can intercept her. Kendra swings her arm with vicious momentum and slaps Colin directly across the face. The sharp, explosive sound of her palm striking his cheek echoes loudly through the crisp morning air. A bright red welt instantly forms across his skin. She screams that he is a pathetic, spineless failure. She obliterates his fabricated victim narrative by loudly exposing the exact financial motive behind the entire heist. Kendra informs the federal agents that Colin is drowning in a massive, unpayable $3 million debt to a notoriously violent Chicago crime syndicate. She explicitly names the criminal organization, revealing that Colin squandered their entire marital savings on a series of catastrophic, highly illegal offshore cryptocurrency ventures. She screams that the mob bosses gave him a strict 30-day deadline to produce the cash or forfeit his life. She declares that Colin targeted Jaden's diagnostic algorithm out of sheer, unadulterated terror. He needed the $7.5 million corporate buyout strictly to prevent the mafia from executing him in his own penthouse. Kendra spits at his feet, her chest heaving with unrestrained fury. She calls him a weak, desperate parasite who attempted to use her brilliant son as a human shield against his own lethal incompetence. The raw, unfiltered hatred radiating from her completely eclipses the loving mother persona she had projected in the courtroom just 48 hours prior. The federal agents do not immediately intervene to separate the warring couple. The lead FBI investigator simply steps back, crossing his arms over his tactical vest, and allows the spectacular self-destruction to continue. Every local police officer on the scene stands in stunned silence. Their uniform-mounted body cameras are actively recording, capturing pristine, high-definition audio of every single venomous confession. Kendra and Colin are systematically dismantling their own legal defense strategies in real time. They furiously hurl specific dates, illicit transaction details, and dark web contractor aliases at each other like weapons. They are voluntarily providing the authorities with a comprehensive, fully detailed roadmap of their entire criminal conspiracy. The lead corporate attorney stands near my rusted pickup truck, rapidly taking notes on his digital tablet. He is quietly documenting the exact nature of their corporate sabotage to ensure the $15 million civil judgment remains utterly bulletproof. Nolan leans toward me on the wooden porch, a sharp, satisfied smirk playing across his features. He whispers that prosecutors normally spend months subpoenaing records and interrogating hostile witnesses to build a federal wire fraud case. Kendra and Colin are handing the United States Department of Justice a flawless, irrefutable conviction on a silver platter. They freely admit to perjury, extortion, identity theft, and grand larceny. The FBI agents simply stand guard, allowing the intense pressure of the collapsed heist to extract every necessary confession. The mutual betrayal is absolute. They have completely condemned each other, sealing their respective fates behind bars without a single interrogation tactic required. The lead agent finally steps forward, signaling his partner to physically secure Kendra. He states clearly that their voluntary, unmirandized statements have been fully documented and will be heavily utilized in federal court. The cold reality of the FBI agent's statement acts as a brutal, instantaneous paralyzer. Kendra suddenly stops screaming. The adrenaline completely drains from her system, replaced by a suffocating, icy terror. Two local patrolmen step forward, gripping her arms to escort her toward the back of a squad car. She looks at the heavy metal cage waiting inside the vehicle. The luxurious penthouse, the designer clothes, and her fabricated upper-class life evaporate into the grim, undeniable prospect of a federal prison cell. Absolute panic takes command of her nervous system. Kendra violently wrenches her arm free from the patrolman's grasp. She does not run toward the street. She drops directly to her knees in the wet grass and crawls frantically toward the wooden steps of my porch. She reaches through the wooden railing and desperately grabs the rough denim fabric of my pant leg. Genuine hysterical tears stream down her ruined makeup. She looks up at me, her voice reduced to a pathetic, shattered plea. She begs me to access the offline server in the basement. She pleads with me to sell the authentic diagnostic algorithm to the tech executives standing in the driveway. She promises to relinquish all future claims to Jaden if I simply use the multi-million-dollar corporate buyout to pay her exorbitant federal bail. She begs her father to save her from the devastating consequences of her own actions. I stand perfectly still, looking down at the woman who abandoned my grandson and attempted to destroy my life. I do not feel an ounce of pity. I reach down, grab her wrist with a firm, calloused grip, and slowly peel her fingers off my jeans. I state with absolute clarity that Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC does not negotiate with federal criminals. I look down at the woman kneeling in the wet grass. She shares my DNA. She shares the exact shade of her mother's eyes. But the person staring back at me is a complete stranger. The profound, suffocating pain of a father who failed to raise a morally grounded human being burns fiercely in the center of my chest. I spent decades working beneath lifted chassis and breathing in exhaust fumes, sacrificing my own physical health to ensure she had every conceivable advantage. I paid for the private universities and funded the initial down payment on her first luxury apartment, believing that financial security would translate into personal integrity. I was catastrophically wrong. My unconditional support only insulated her from reality. It bred a monstrous, calculating entitlement that allowed her to abandon a special needs infant the moment his diagnosis inconvenienced her pristine lifestyle. Now stripped of her expensive designer coats and her highly rehearsed victim narratives, she is reduced to begging the very man she attempted to destroy. I see the stark terror in her expression as the federal agents lock their heavy tactical belts. She is not crying out of remorse for weaponizing her deceased mother's medical records. She is not crying for the 9 years of her son's life she willfully threw away. She is crying entirely for herself. She is weeping because the brilliant, impenetrable trap she constructed alongside a desperate syndicate debtor has finally snapped shut on her own wrists. The crushing weight of my parental failure settles over my shoulders, but it does not weaken my resolve. It solidifies my absolute certainty that rescuing her now would be the ultimate act of cruelty. Kendra screams my name, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoes against the brick facades of the surrounding suburban houses. She claws desperately at the heavy denim of my jeans, her manicured nails digging into the fabric with frantic, animalistic panic. She begs me to look at the tech executives to utilize my corporate authority to authorize a partial asset transfer just to cover the imminent federal bail bonds. I do not raise my voice. I do not offer a single syllable of anger or vindictive satisfaction. I simply look down at her with absolute, unwavering emptiness. I lock my hands around her wrists. Her skin is cold and trembling violently. With methodical, unyielding pressure, I pry her fingers away from my clothing one by one. She thrashes against my grip, sobbing that I cannot abandon my own daughter to the federal penal system. I release her hands and take a definitive, heavy step backward, putting a crucial physical barrier between her hysteria and my meticulously secured perimeter. My retreat leaves her entirely unanchored. She slumps forward, her hands hitting the muddy gravel of the driveway. The two local patrolmen instantly close the gap. They grip her by the elbows, hauling her upward with the harsh, practiced efficiency of law enforcement securing a volatile suspect. The cold steel of their issued handcuffs rattles sharply. Kendra struggles against their hold, violently twisting her shoulders, completely refusing to accept the catastrophic reality of her immediate incarceration. Nolan steps slightly in front of me, his leather briefcase held firmly at his side, creating an impenetrable legal wall. He nods silently to the lead FBI agent, signaling that the CEO of Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC, has concluded all interaction with the hostile suspects. The lead FBI agent steps forward, officially reading Kendra her Miranda rights over the deafening sound of her continued screaming. She thrashes violently against the patrolman, twisting her neck to lock her desperate, terrified gaze onto my face one final time. She demands to know how I can be so heartless, how I can stand on my porch and watch the mother of my grandson be hauled away in federal chains. She shrieks that family is supposed to protect family regardless of the circumstances. The sheer audacity of her statement crystallizes the air in my lungs. I step forward to the absolute edge of the wooden porch. I ensure my posture is perfectly straight and my voice carries the heavy, unassailable weight of a federal judge passing a final sentence. I tell her that abandoned children learn to grow. They learn to adapt, to build impenetrable digital fortresses, and to thrive in the absence of those who discarded them. I state that Jaden did not need her protection, and he certainly never needed her fraudulent interference. I tell her that erring adults must face the absolute crushing consequences of their own unrestrained greed. I declare that she made a calculated, malicious choice to weaponize family law and corporate acquisition to steal millions from a vulnerable minor. I remind her that she did not care about family when she boarded a plane 9 years ago, leaving a severely autistic child in my living room without a single backward glance. The truth strikes her like physical force. The remaining fight drains completely from her body. Her shoulders slump in total defeat as the irrefutable reality of my final verdict permanently severs the last remaining thread of our biological connection. I do not wait to watch the patrolman secure the steel restraints around her wrists. I turn my back on the driveway, completely severing my visual connection to the spectacular wreckage of her life. I walk steadily toward the heavy oak front door of my house. Jaden steps out from the shadowed hallway, holding his favorite noise-canceling headphones loosely in his right hand. He has watched the entire tactical execution through the reinforced glass of the living room window. His expression is completely calm, utterly unbothered by the flashing police lights and the severe presence of federal agents on our front lawn. The complex, beautiful machinery of his mind has already processed the elimination of the threat. I place a heavy, reassuring hand on his shoulder. He leans slightly into my grip, a silent acknowledgement that our meticulously designed fortress remains entirely secure. We step backward into the warm, quiet sanctuary of our home. Behind us, the frantic, muffled sounds of Kendra's final screams echo across the driveway as the officers forcibly shove her into the rigid plastic back seat of the squad car. The heavy vehicle doors slam shut in rapid succession, a definitive metallic impact that formally concludes the multi-million-dollar heist. I grip the brass handle of the front door and pull it shut with a solid, satisfying click. The heavy deadbolt slides into place, instantly cutting off the noise of the sirens, the federal agents, and the shattered remnants of my former daughter. The house is enveloped in absolute protective silence. The corporate trap has successfully executed. The predators have been permanently neutralized by the federal justice system. Jaden turns toward the kitchen, picking up his tablet to resume his coding, and our lives resume their perfectly structured rhythm. The fallout from the driveway confrontation materialized with staggering speed. Federal prosecutors did not even need to offer Colin a plea deal to extract actionable intelligence. His hysterical, terrified screaming on my front lawn had provided the FBI with exact names, offshore cryptocurrency ledgers, and specific routing numbers tied directly to the Chicago syndicate. Within 48 hours, the Financial Crimes Division coordinated a massive multi-agency tactical strike. Heavily armed tactical teams simultaneously breached 4 separate luxury high-rises in downtown Chicago, seizing millions in illicit assets and arresting the exact mob enforcers who had placed the $3 million bounty on Colin's head. The organized crime ring that had indirectly threatened my home was entirely dismantled before they even realized their Silicon Valley heist had failed. I received a brief, highly encrypted phone call from the lead FBI investigator confirming the successful raids. He informed me that Colin and Kendra were being held in separate federal detention centers, without bail, fully isolated from each other and the outside world. The threat of mafia retaliation against my family evaporated completely. The syndicate bosses were now facing federal racketeering charges built on the precise forensic financial data Colin had foolishly handed over in his desperate attempt to blame his wife. By trying to save himself, Colin had inadvertently sterilized my environment of any lingering criminal elements. Jaden and I remained untouched, insulated by the thick legal walls of Wendell Tech Solutions. The chaotic, violent storm Kendra had dragged to my doorstep had been entirely neutralized by the federal government, leaving our quiet suburban street completely peaceful once again. The federal indictments triggered an immediate violent whiplash in the local media cycle. The exact same municipal news stations that had gleefully broadcast Kendra's fabricated victim narrative just days prior were now forced to scramble for credibility. The federal courthouse unsealed the preliminary charges against my daughter and her husband, instantly exposing the fraudulent custody battle as a highly calculated corporate espionage operation. The sensationalized story of an abusive, controlling grandfather keeping a special needs child hostage disintegrated overnight. In its place, the media broadcast a massive primetime public retraction. Lead anchors stared directly into the cameras and detailed how a local mechanic had successfully outsmarted a multi-million-dollar fraud ring using an impenetrable corporate structure. They explicitly cleared my name, retracting every false allegation Kendra had planted in the municipal family court. The severe social damage inflicted upon my reputation was erased with absolute finality. The neighbors who had previously cast suspicious, judgmental glances toward my property now walked past my driveway with a distinct sense of intimidated respect. They realized the rusted pickup truck parked on the gravel belonged to the CEO of a highly coveted tech firm. Nolan expertly managed the press fallout, issuing a single lethal press release on behalf of Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC. The statement simply confirmed the arrest of the hostile actors and reiterated our commitment to Jaden's privacy and technological development. We offered zero apologies and zero additional context. I did not care about the public validation or the sudden shift in neighborhood gossip. I only cared that the legal and social perimeters surrounding my grandson were completely restored. The false narrative was dead, leaving only the unassailable truth of our corporate sovereignty. Exactly 1 week after the federal arrests, the heavy hum of armored SUVs returned to my street. This time, there were no police cruisers or tactical FBI agents accompanying them. The vehicles parked respectfully along the curb, explicitly avoiding my front lawn. The Silicon Valley Tech Corporation had returned, but they had fundamentally altered their approach. The aggressive, intimidating corporate lawyers who had slammed the fraudulent contract onto my truck hood were gone. In their place, the corporation dispatched a specialized team of executive negotiators. They walked up my porch steps carrying slim leather portfolios, their postures projecting extreme caution rather than arrogant superiority. I unlocked the heavy oak door and allowed them into my living room. Jaden remained upstairs in his specialized workspace, completely insulated from the corporate maneuvering below. The executives sat stiffly on my worn fabric sofa, acutely aware that they were operating entirely within my domain. Nolan stood beside the fireplace, his arms crossed, radiating absolute legal authority. The lead negotiator, a sharply dressed executive with a calm, measured voice, immediately offered a formal apology for the previous hostile interaction. He acknowledged that their firm had been severely compromised by Colin's sophisticated fraud, but he emphasized that their primary objective remained entirely unchanged. They had spent the last week actively monitoring the federal fallout and reviewing the publicly available patents filed under Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC. They recognized the authentic monumental value of the diagnostic algorithm locked in my basement. They were no longer dealing with desperate criminals seeking a quick payout. They were now negotiating with a firmly established, legally fortified corporate entity. The lead executive unzipped his portfolio and extracted a pristine, heavily bound legal document. He placed it carefully onto my scuffed wooden coffee table and slid it precisely across the surface until it rested directly in front of me. He stated that the corporation was fully prepared to execute a legitimate, fully verified acquisition of the diagnostic software. They offered to immediately reinstate the original $7.5 million buyout, effectively replacing the fraudulent escrow account with a direct wire transfer to Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC. He promised absolute corporate integration, guaranteeing Jaden a secure, highly compensated advisory role within their engineering division. They presented the massive financial sum as an undeniable victory, fully expecting me to sign the paperwork and hand over the master code base. I looked down at the staggering financial figure printed on the top page. I did not blink. I placed my calloused fingertips directly onto the thick parchment and slowly, deliberately slid the contract back across the table until it rested in front of the executive. I stated clearly that the core algorithm was no longer for sale. The executive's confident posture shattered, his eyes widening in total shock at the immediate rejection. I explained that selling the software outright would surrender our control over its application, allowing their corporation to restrict medical access behind expensive paywalls. I announced my alternative directive. Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC, would retain absolute ownership of the intellectual property. We would license the diagnostic framework to their corporation on a strict, non-exclusive annual basis, guaranteeing a continuous stream of revenue while allowing Jaden to develop the software entirely on his own terms. We would not accept a one-time buyout. We were establishing a permanent corporate empire. The lead executive stares at the rejected contract resting on the edge of my scuffed coffee table. He blinks rapidly, utterly failing to process the immediate dismissal of a $7.5 million cash offer. He opens his mouth to counter instinctively, assuming this is a sophisticated bluff designed to force a higher acquisition price. Nolan intercepts the executive before a single syllable can materialize. My attorney steps smoothly away from the brick fireplace, projecting absolute legal dominance within the small confines of my living room. He places his leather briefcase on the table and extracts a single pristine binder containing our official counter-proposal. Nolan lays out our terms with cold, unyielding precision. He explicitly states that Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC will never relinquish the core patents, the proprietary machine learning architecture, or the foundational source code. The executives exchange nervous, bewildered glances. They are accustomed to dealing with desperate startup founders eager to liquidate their creations for an early retirement. They completely underestimate the fundamental purpose of this corporation. I did not build an impenetrable legal fortress simply to sell the keys to the highest bidder. This company exists solely to protect the intellectual legacy of my grandson. The lead negotiator attempts to argue that their corporate infrastructure requires full ownership to integrate the software safely into their global medical networks. Nolan completely shuts down the argument. He points out that the algorithm is entirely unique, fundamentally years ahead of their internal research and development capabilities. The tech giant desperately needs this technology to survive the rapidly approaching shifts in the competitive medical diagnostic market. The balance of power is entirely on our side of the table. Wendell Tech Solutions, LLC will retain 100% ownership of the intellectual property, and that specific condition is absolutely non-negotiable. The corporate negotiators shift uncomfortably on the worn fabric of my sofa. The lead executive attempts to find a structural loophole. He carefully suggests a majority shareholder acquisition, offering to buy a controlling stake in the LLC while allowing me to maintain a nominal board position. I reject the notion instantly. Nolan slides a pristine, meticulously drafted 50-page licensing agreement across the table. He dictates the strict mechanics of our business relationship moving forward. The tech giant will not operate as an owner, a partner, or a shareholder. They will operate strictly as a corporate lessee. They will pay for the explicit right to use the algorithm, not own it. Nolan explains that we will provide them with a heavily encrypted application programming interface. This secure digital bridge will allow their global medical networks to funnel diagnostic data through Jaden's machine learning core and receive the incredibly accurate medical assessments they so desperately need. However, the foundational artificial intelligence will remain permanently locked within our physical and digital vaults. The licensing agreement contains brutal, unforgiving stipulations designed to protect our asset. If their engineering team makes any unauthorized attempt to reverse engineer the source code, the license terminates immediately without refund. If they violate any data privacy protocols, access is instantly revoked. The lead executive wipes a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. He realizes the absolute brilliance of the cage we have constructed. The corporation will have to pay millions for the privilege of utilizing the technology, absorb all the massive distribution and marketing costs, and navigate all the medical compliance regulations. While my small suburban company assumes absolutely zero operational risk, they are essentially renting the engine to power their multi-billion-dollar corporate vehicle. The atmosphere in the living room shifts entirely as the negotiation transitions strictly to the financial parameters. The lead executive attempts to regain a fraction of his lost leverage by trying to aggressively lowball the licensing fee, citing his corporation's massive operational overhead and the risks associated with utilizing leased technology. Nolan does not flinch. He dictates the non-negotiable financial terms with lethal mathematical precision. The initial access fee to execute the licensing agreement is exactly $10 million. Nolan specifies that this amount must be verified via direct federal wire transfer into the Wendell Tech Solutions corporate accounts within 24 hours of signing. This massive upfront capitalization immediately covers the development value and solidifies the undeniable legitimacy of the contract. But the true devastating leverage lies in the permanent residuals. Nolan demands a mandatory 5% annual royalty on all gross profits generated by any medical system application or corporate division utilizing Jaden's algorithm. The executives visibly balk at the royalty percentage, loudly claiming it is completely unprecedented for a licensing deal of this specific scale. I lean forward, resting my elbows on my knees, locking eyes with the lead negotiator. I calmly remind him that without our exact algorithm, their highly publicized medical diagnostic division will catastrophically collapse under the crushing weight of their unfulfilled promises to Wall Street shareholders. Their stock price will plummet the moment the market realizes they lost the technological arms race. The silence in the living room becomes heavy and absolute. The lead executive looks left and right at his silent legal team, fully recognizing their complete lack of leverage. He pulls a heavy gold pen from his inner jacket pocket and signs the bottom of our agreement. The $10 million and the continuous massive royalty stream are permanently locked in. The final stipulation of the newly minted corporate alliance concerns the primary architect of the software himself. The tech executives, now legally bound to a continuous financial commitment, desperately want absolute assurance that the codebase will be actively maintained and updated. I outline the strict, unyielding employment conditions for my lead engineer. Jaden is formally retained as a remote senior technical consultant for their global corporation. He will never be required to step foot inside their chaotic Silicon Valley headquarters. He will never be forced to conform to rigid neurotypical corporate expectations or endure suffocating board meetings. He will work entirely on his own schedule, operating exclusively from his customized, sensory-friendly workspace on the second floor of my house. His lucrative consultancy salary, combined with the $10 million upfront fee and the massive annual corporate royalties, will entirely bypass standard commercial banking channels. Nolan has spent the last year meticulously establishing an impenetrable multi-tiered financial trust. Every single cent generated by the algorithm is legally bound and heavily encrypted by a network of elite financial fiduciaries. The funds are placed in a completely untouchable account that strictly matures on Jaden's 25th birthday. Neither I nor any biological relative who might attempt to miraculously resurface in the future can access a single fraction of the capital. The trust mandates strict continuous oversight by a board of independent federal auditors. The corporate executives pack the signed licensing agreements into their portfolios, their expressions reflecting a distinct mixture of total defeat and profound professional respect. They quietly exit my home, their armored SUVs finally rolling out of my neighborhood. I walk upstairs and open the door to Jaden's room. He is quietly typing away at his dual-illuminated monitors, entirely absorbed in his work. The violent storm has permanently passed. The fortune is unconditionally secured. His future is absolutely bulletproof. 6 months have passed since the fleet of armored vehicles rolled out of our neighborhood, taking the final remnants of deception and greed with them. The stifling summer heat has surrendered to a crisp, biting autumn wind that sweeps through the quiet suburban streets. Golden and crimson leaves scatter across the very driveway where federal agents completely dismantled a multi-million-dollar extortion plot. The flashing red and blue lights, the frantic screams, and the hostile corporate maneuvers feel like a distant, faded memory. They are nothing more than fading echoes replaced by the steady, predictable rhythm of ordinary life. The neighbors have stopped casting lingering, curious glances toward our property. They have returned to their own daily routines, completely unaware of the massive financial empire operating silently behind our drawn curtains. The profound silence that envelops our home is no longer the tense, suffocating quiet of an impending siege. It is the deep, resonant tranquility of absolute security. We survived the absolute worst of human nature, and we emerged not just intact but entirely untouchable. I wake up every morning before the sun rises, stepping out into the cool morning air without the crushing burden of hypervigilance pressing against my chest. The perimeter is secure. The legal safeguards are actively holding the line. There are no more unexpected knocks on the door, no more fraudulent court summons, and absolutely no more manipulative strangers attempting to breach our walls. The chaos that Kendra dragged into our lives has been entirely neutralized. It has been sterilized by the unforgiving mechanics of federal justice and corporate litigation. The autumn wind carries away the last dead leaves, leaving our property clean, fortified, and firmly anchored in the present reality of our undisputed victory. I walk out onto the wraparound porch and take my seat in a heavy solid oak chair I built with my own hands decades ago. The wood is worn and deeply polished by time, a testament to enduring craftsmanship and quiet persistence. It holds my weight with unyielding support. I hold a steaming mug of bitter black coffee, letting the heat seep into my calloused palms. Sitting just a few feet away, entirely engrossed in his own world, is Jaden. He occupies a sturdy wicker chair, resting a massive state-of-the-art laptop on his knees. The machine is a powerhouse custom-built to handle the immense computational load of his ongoing projects. His fingers fly across the illuminated keyboard with a mesmerizing rhythmic precision. He is no longer simply maintaining the original diagnostic software that saved us. He is actively writing the next generation of the code, expanding its machine learning capabilities to detect increasingly complex medical anomalies. The steady tapping of the keys blends seamlessly with the rustling autumn leaves. He wears his noise-canceling headphones not out of distress but to achieve total unbroken focus. The $10 million licensing fee we secured from the tech giant easily afforded him any luxury he could ever want, yet his only request was upgraded processing power and a faster, dedicated fiber optic internet connection. He does not care about the wealth sitting in his ironclad trust fund. He cares only about the logic, the structure, and the infinite possibilities of his digital architecture. Watching him work, I feel a profound sense of vindication. The brilliant, beautiful mind that Kendra abandoned as a burden is currently reshaping the future of global medical technology right here on my front porch. He is safe, he is focused, and he is entirely free to create. The consequences of their unmitigated greed materialized with brutal mathematical efficiency. Kendra and Colin are currently serving lengthy federal prison sentences in separate maximum security facilities. The United States Department of Justice did not offer leniency. The overwhelming mountain of evidence they provided against each other during their spectacular driveway collapse guaranteed their total ruin. They are stripped of their designer clothes, their luxurious penthouse, and their heavily fabricated victim narratives. They are reduced to uniform numbers in a rigid, unforgiving penal system where manipulation holds absolutely zero currency. The $15 million civil judgment secured by the tech corporation aggressively liquidated whatever fractional assets Colin had left, leaving him entirely destitute. Furthermore, the violent Chicago syndicate that drove his desperate heist no longer exists to collect their debt. The massive FBI raid, fueled directly by Colin's panicked recorded confessions, dismantled the criminal organization from the top down. The mob enforcers who threatened his life are now sharing the same federal cell blocks. The threat has been eradicated from every possible angle. Order has been permanently restored to our lives, not through forgiveness or passive acceptance, but through the uncompromising establishment of lethal boundaries. I learned the hardest lesson a father can endure. Biological connection does not automatically generate loyalty, and toxic rot must be ruthlessly excised before it infects the healthy tissue. I severed the diseased branch of my family tree to save the roots. The resulting peace is pristine and absolute. We are insulated by thick layers of corporate law, strict federal oversight, and a multi-million-dollar financial fortress that ensures no one will ever attempt to exploit my grandson again. The predators have been permanently locked in cages of their own making, leaving us to thrive entirely unbothered. The steady, rapid clicking of the keyboard suddenly stops. Jaden lowers the screen of his laptop just enough to look across the wooden porch. He slides one of the thick acoustic cups of his headphones off his ear, letting the ambient sounds of the suburban morning filter into his awareness. He looks directly at me, his eyes clear and entirely present. Slowly, the corners of his mouth turn upward into a rare, incredibly genuine smile. It is a quiet, subtle expression of pure contentment, completely devoid of the crushing anxiety that used to govern his days. I raise my coffee mug to him in a silent, respectful salute. He slides the headphone back over his ear, opens the laptop screen, and immediately resumes his extraordinary work. That single fleeting smile is worth vastly more than the millions sitting in the corporate trust accounts. It is the ultimate confirmation that our brutal war was absolutely necessary. True peace is not something you are simply handed. It is not achieved by bowing to extortion or enabling the destructive behavior of desperate, greedy adults. Peace is aggressively forged. It is manufactured by recognizing the rot confronting the threat head-on and cutting it out without a single ounce of hesitation. I sacrificed the illusion of a perfect traditional family to secure the reality of a safe one. The emotional wreckage of the past 9 years has been completely cleared away, leaving bare, solid rock in its wake. Upon that rock, we have built an empire defined by logic, unyielding protection, and unconditional support. The foundation of our lives is finally unbreakable. As the cool autumn wind sweeps across the porch, I take another slow sip of black coffee. We are finally permanently at peace. True family is not defined by biology or social expectations. It is defined by unwavering loyalty, mutual respect, and the absolute willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Greed will always blind toxic individuals to the catastrophic consequences of their actions, causing them to trade permanent relationships for temporary financial gain. When malicious people threaten your sanctuary, you must possess the courage to enforce impenetrable boundaries. Forgiveness is a choice, but strict protection remains a mandatory obligation. You must ruthlessly excise the rot from your life to allow healthy roots to grow. Peace is never granted. It is forged. Did you enjoy this story? Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives of justice and redemption.